Quorum being present, the Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. Before we begin, I'd like to extend my thoughts and prayers to all those affected by the shooting this morning in Virginia. I'm very grateful for the heroic actions taken by members of the Capitol Police, and I'm hopeful that my colleague and good friend, Majority Whip Steve Scalise, and the others who were shot this morning will make a full and speedy recovery. I also want to recognize Capitol Police Officers Crystal Griner and David Bailey, Representative Roger Williams, legislative correspondent, Zachary Barth, and former staffer and Tyson Food lobbyist Matt Micah. I think it reminds us how vulnerable we are, why this committee is so important to protect Americans and to protect members from these horrific actions. And I think, as the Speaker put so well this morning on the House floor, an attack on one of us is truly an attack on all of us. And I hope, if anything positive comes out of this, that we can restore some civility to this chamber and to our public discourse. The committee is meeting today for consideration of H.R. 2825, the Department of Homeland Security Authorization Act of 2017. Chair announces that any requests for recorded votes may be rolled, and he may recess the committee at any point. Without objection, so ordered. Chair plans to provide adequate notice prior to taking the votes and will have the clerk of the committee provide notice to members. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. The United States constantly faces national security challenges brought forth by Islamist terrorists, human traffickers, drug smugglers, and nation states waging a silent war on our cybersecurity, among others. These adversaries are constantly looking for ways to inflict as much damage as possible, and over the tenure of this committee, we've sadly had too many wake-up calls. After the 9/11 attacks, our nation's leaders decided that one of the best ways to protect our country was with the creation of a Department of Homeland Security. While we are stronger and better prepared today, America's enemies have proven to be very agile. However, we can stay ahead of these ever-evolving threats by reforming and improving our DHS through a first-ever reauthorization. Specifically, an authorization will better protect America by mandating new homeland threat assessments, strengthening information and intelligence sharing among federal, state, and local authorities, supporting our frontline defenders and first responders, bolstering cybersecurity at America's ports, enhancing cargo security, increasing TSA's use of canine teams for explosive detections, protecting taxpayers with new cost efficiencies to cut waste, and ensuring better security at last point of departure points. Many may wonder if this legislation is necessary to achieve these goals. The truth is a full and bipartisan reauthorization offers a number of key changes to DHS. Many people do not grasp the jurisdiction realities of our committee, and I'm sure all members here have had more than one example of frustration. This reality has helped push reauthorization out of our grasp. For 15 years since the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, it has never been reauthorized by Congress. But earlier this year, under the signature of the Speaker, Chairman, and 8 different committees, we came together to sign a memorandum of understanding to do just that. This MOU states that all committees of jurisdiction agree to reauthorize DHS headquarters and its components on a regular basis. This is not a one-time deal. It is the establishment of a regular process that will ensure robust oversight and improve the operation of the department for the benefit of the American people. This legislation will also reassert Congress's Article 1 authorities under the Constitution to write laws and give direction to the department. Congress has simply abdicated its role in providing comprehensive legislation direction and as a result, ceded power to the executive branch. This legislation will codify agencies like the TSA, which are essential to our national security. And as I previously stated, this effort will strengthen and support our frontline defenders and first responders. When a national tragedy occurs, the heroism of these brave men and women is on display, as we saw this morning. This bill authorizes important grant programs significantly above the President's FY18 budget request and currently appropriated levels. The grants will provide critical resources to first responders and others in our cities, counties, and states for terrorism prevention and response efforts, and bolster transit and port security. A full reauthorization will also protect taxpayer dollars and hold DHS more accountable by providing greater oversight of the acquisition process to ensure that cost, schedule, and performance requirements are met. Finally, it will make DHS more efficient by consolidating and eliminating unnecessary programs and offices. This will be made possible by streamlining offices with overlapping duties, cutting unnecessary positions, and better outlining respective responsibilities. I'd also like to stress that a vast majority of this bill has already been considered by this committee. And as we go forward to getting this to the floor, we'll combine this legislation with measures from other committees. Secretary Kelly sat before us on 2 separate occasions and stated how meaningful this reauthorization truly is. In February, he stated, quote, "The threats and challenges have changed since Congress created DHS some 15 years ago. We need to update the authorities and to successfully complete our mission today," end of quote. And just last week, he stated, quote, "This is an important endeavor which will provide the department with the authorities it needs to carry out its mission." I'm proud to say that this reauthorization has been a strong, bipartisan, and collective effort like many in our recent past. Of note, the Cybersecurity Act, enhancements to aviation security, the authorization of CBP, increased support for first responders, improved counterterrorism information sharing, and various taxpayer dollar-saving efforts. Passing this important reauthorization will be another major bipartisan accomplishment. We simply also would not be here today if it wasn't for the efforts of former Chairman Benny Thompson and Peter King. Both of these men helped lead the charge to make this reauthorization possible. It is because of their hard work that we are all on the path of getting it done. I'd like to thank all the members on this committee, as well as many of the hardworking congressional and DHS staffers who have worked tirelessly on this legislation, and I look forward to taking a big step today to getting it across the finish line. With that, I ask unanimous consent that letters of support from the following organizations be inserted into the record: the Major County Sheriffs of America, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, the National Fusion Center Association, the American Conservative Union, the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General, Business Executives for National Security, and IT Alliance for Public Sector, and the Project Management Institute. Without objection, so ordered. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me at the outset associate myself with the statements relative to the situation that occurred this morning. All of us really feel a sad feeling in our bodies because of what occurred. We've had hearing after hearing that talks about lone wolves, acts of domestic terrorism that happen here on the homeland, and how vulnerable sometimes we feel. But the men and women who protect us all over the country, the first responders and otherwise, do a good job. And I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we provide not only the resources in terms of money, but the training that departments can train together so that when situations like the one this morning, the coordination works. And from all indication, this situation, as bad as it was, federal, state, and local first responders did it by the book. And so that's a tribute to them. But that being said, you have from the Democratic side today some amendments that will ask for resources over and above what's been put in the budget, because communities are still at risk, and we have to recognize that, and we can't balance the budget and put communities at risk. We have to come up with a way of getting the resources necessary for our men and women to protect communities. So you'll see that as we go forward today. But this is indeed a step in the right direction. We have a number of challenges as a committee. Everybody wants a little piece of us. This is an opportunity for us to stake out legislative jurisdiction for this committee, which we so desperately need. Testimony after testimony before us talks about how many committees and subcommittees Homeland Security staff is tasked with responding to. We should be just like every other committee of jurisdiction. We should have primary jurisdiction for the department people think we already over. So I look forward to the day markup on this authorization bill so we can move forward in that direction. And so this summer, as you know, will be the 16th anniversary of the 2001 terrorist attacks that prompted Congress to establish this Department of Homeland Security. Today's markup comes at a critical time for the department, whose mission includes preventing terrorism, managing our borders, and ensuring resilience. President Trump, however, has placed DHS on a back burner. He has been slow to nominate the department's senior leadership. As of today, Secretary Kelly and Deputy Secretary Duke are the only Senate-confirmed principals at that department. Even though it is peak travel season, there's no permanent leadership at the Transportation Security Administration. Hurricane season has begun without a FEMA administrator, and despite there being an ongoing threat to our nation's cybersecurity, there is no leader at the National Protection and Program Directorate. This is a big problem. While I share the chairman's view that providing regular guidance and support to the department through a regular authorization process is a good thing, ultimately, DHS needs leaders in place to drive it in a positive direction. DHS also needs adequate resources to carry out its diverse mission and support capabilities at the state and local level. While President Trump, through his budget, prioritizes keeping a campaign promise to build a mythical wall along the southern border, it leaves first responders on their own and vital security program with little to build upon. The Democratic members of this committee remain committed to raising the level of security and preparedness across the nation. Recently, Secretary Kelly acknowledged the diverse and ever-evolving threat. The Secretary stated, "The threat to our nation and our American way of life has not diminished. In fact, the threat has metastasized and decentralized, and the risk is as threatening today as it was that September morning almost 16 years ago." Today, Democrats will be offering a number of amendments that underscore a continued commitment to first responders and to protecting infrastructure that terrorists have been known to target, ports and mass transit. I would note that bipartisan agreement was reached on a number of amendments to be considered today but that some of our major open issues remain. Democrats plan to offer amendments to prevent the DHS workforce from ever being left hung out to dry like they were when President Trump issued the travel ban. Also, prevent DHS from taking land from law-abiding Americans to build Trump's wall, and prevent hardworking Americans from lining their pockets of President Trump with their taxpayers' dollars. We have an obligation to provide guidance to DHS. Enactment of these Democratic amendments would do just that. Before I close, I'd like to express support for one of the amendments that the majority has proposed. It would strike Section 872 from the Homeland Security Act, thereby preventing the Secretary of Homeland Security from unilaterally reorganizing components within the department. Adoption of this amendment would ensure that reorganizations within DHS are within the purview of this committee and lead authorizers for the department. Again, Mr. Chairman, I compliment you for your leadership on getting us to this point, and I look forward to the rest of the committee meeting. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and let me compliment you and your staff as well for working so well with the majority staff. By agreement between the chair and ranking member of the committee, by unanimous consent, shall use an amendment roster today.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking member second.
reserving the right to object, and I will not, would the chair please explain our agreement regarding the amendment roster? I yield to the chairman.
And I thank the gentleman and all committee members for agreeing to the use of an amendment roster, because we're dealing with one bill with a large amendment in the nature of a substitute that includes a number of titles. The roster has been arranged in order of title. We've agreed that the amendment in the nature of a substitute is open to amendment at any point, and that we shall take up amendments in the order listed on the roster. Chair will allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster out of order to the extent practicable and in a manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion of consideration of each title or at the conclusion of consideration of the roster. Additionally, it's my understanding there's a bipartisan agreement on the number of amendments. The chairman may ask unanimous consent to consider amendments that have been agreed to en bloc at the beginning of each title in an effort to expedite the process. Any member with an amendment included in an en bloc would be recognized to speak regarding their amendment if they wish.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for that explanation. I withdraw my reservation.
I thank the ranking member. I now call up H.R. 2825, the Department of Homeland Security Authorization Act of 2017. The bill was circulated in advance, and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 2825.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Bills considered read and open to amendment at any point. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute listed on the roster. The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2825, offered by Mr. McCall.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for purposes of amendment. The amendment in the nature of the substitute was noticed to committee members in compliance with the rules. Is there any discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Smith is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this year, I signed an MOU with 7 other chairmen of committees who share jurisdiction with this committee on matters related to reauthorization of programs within the Department of Homeland Security. Since then, staff from this committee and staff from the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee have worked closely on issues of shared jurisdiction. Generally, this collaboration has included discussion over the organization and management of research and development activities within DHS, as well as DHS's chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosives activities. Specifically, our respective staffs continued to coordinate on policies involving programs such as those within the Science and Technology Directorate and the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office. As chairman of the House Science Committee, I will continue to honor the MOU by working with you and the other committee chairmen who signed the document. To that end, I will note that the bill before the committee today, H.R. 2825, includes provisions related to the activities I just described. While I do not have an amendment at the desk, I have an understanding, based on the joint MOU and on exchanges between our respective committee staffs, that the Science Committee's jurisdiction and input will continue to be honored and solicited as we work together in a manner consistent with the principles of the MOU. In return, I will work with you to expedite any legislation over which the Science Committee shares jurisdiction with this committee regarding the DHS. Mr. Chairman, on Monday, the Science Committee staff provided some suggestions and requested a handful of consistent, constructive additions to the bill. I understand you and your staff will work with me and my staff before bringing this legislation to the House floor to accommodate the Science Committee's input on provisions in H.R. 2825 over which we share jurisdiction.
I thank the gentleman, and let me say I commit to working with you, Chairman Smith, and your staff over provisions we share jurisdiction as the DHS reauthorization bill moves to the floor.
Okay. I thank the chairman and commend him for his hard work on this great piece of legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. There being no further discussion of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the committee will move to consideration of the amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute listed on the roster. I now call up Title I of the amendment in the nature of a substitute for consideration. We have agreement on a number of amendments to Title I, so pursuant to the chairman's previous announcement, I ask unanimous consent to consider the following amendments en bloc. Mr. Perry, number 043. Mr. Thompson, 020. Fitzpatrick, 051. Ms. Jackson Lee, 103. Mr. Richmond, 014. Mr. Richmond, 013. Mr. Payne, 018. Mr. Payne, 005. Ms. Watson-Coleman, 005. Ms. Watson-Coleman, 004. Ms. Rice, number 4. Without objection, so ordered, the clerk shall report the en bloc amendment.
En bloc amendment offered by Mr. McCall.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Does any member with an amendment included in the en bloc wish to be recognized? Ms. Watson-Coleman is recognized.
That's what I thought.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, please let me associate myself with both your comments and Mr. Thompson's comments as it relates to the situation we had today. And I want to thank God for his grace and mercy over all of them. And I wish my colleague and the staff members, as well as the wonderful Capitol Police, a quick healing and return to work. I do have 2 amendments at the desk, and I wish to be recognized.
The general lady is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, in recent years, we have witnessed devastating attacks and acts of harassment against faith-based organizations in the United States. From the horrific attack at the AME Chapel in Charleston, South Carolina, to the recent wave of vandalism and harassment at the Jewish temples and community centers, faith-based and community organizations are indeed facing increasing threats. These same organizations are invaluable partners in carrying out important missions at the department, from disaster response and resilience to combating human trafficking. Over a decade ago, then-President Bush established the Department of Homeland Security Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships to ensure that DHS engage effectively with these important community partners. Over time, the center's mission has evolved from bringing faith-based and neighborhood organizations together with emergency managers to partnering with these groups to fight human trafficking. Today, the center also serves as a conduit for providing best practices and technical assistance to religious leaders seeking to make their houses of worship more secure. My first amendment would formally authorize the center. Mr. Chairman, my second amendment improves the underlying bill by directing Homeland Security Advisory Council to provide advice to the department in the preparation of the Quadrennial Homeland Security Review, QHSR. Since 2007, DHS has been required every 4 years to do a comprehensive review of the department to ensure that its programs and activities are properly aligned with its missions and goals. DHS has to date produced 2 QHSRs that, according to the Government Accountability Office, which has evaluated them, would benefit from greater stakeholder input. The Homeland Security Advisory Council is an independent body of state, local, and private partners tasked with providing the Secretary advice to support decision-making across the spectrum of Homeland Security operations. My amendment would ensure future QHSRs are informed by meaningful stakeholder engagement. I thank you for your support, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the en bloc amendment?
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Payne is recognized.
thank you. I have two amendments at the desk. Mr. Chairman, my first amendment is based on the text of H.R. 1372, the Homeland Security for Children Act, a bill I introduced and that passed the House. My amendment would require DHS to incorporate feedback from organizations representing children into department-wide activity. It would also codify the children's technical expert position at FEMA, whose responsibility it is to incorporate the needs of children into all emergency planning, response, and mitigation activities. On 9/11, I was responsible for student transportation in Essex County, New Jersey, and my last student did not get home until 11:30 at night amidst the chaos. We have made progress prioritizing the unique needs of children in a disaster planning over the past 16 years, but we can do much better. My second amendment seeks to ensure that DHS engages in a more thorough vetting of any reorganization proposal by directing the GAO to review the plan DHS ultimately submits to Congress. Last Congress, this committee considered legislation that would have consolidated certain offices within the Department of Homeland Security into a chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosives office, the CBRNE office. After the bill passed the House, the Government Accountability Office issued a review of DHS plans that raised new questions about the scheme. The GAO found that the department failed to assess the document potential problems that could result from consolidation, compare the associated benefits and costs, and engage in stakeholder outreach. The activities DHS carries out in this mission space are more important now than ever. We cannot afford for DHS to take an approach that jeopardizes operations. I urge my colleagues to support my amendments, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the en bloc amendment? Ms. Rice is recognized.
I have an amendment at the desk. My amendment, Mr. Chairman, would require the Secretary to provide written guidance to relevant DHS personnel before any executive order affecting department functions, programs, or operations takes effect. Earlier this year, the rollout of the President's executive order on the Muslim travel ban was, by any measure, sudden, uncoordinated, and chaotic. At airports across the country, CBP officers were not provided timely guidance and were left to interpret for themselves how to implement this broad order. To prevent another fiasco on this scale, we need to make sure DHS personnel receive timely guidance prior to the implementation of any new executive orders. Regardless of whether you support or oppose the President's travel ban, we should all be able to agree that the chaos we saw during its implementation undermined the Department's security functions and operations and have a responsibility to ensure that that never happens again. I urge my colleagues to accept this amendment, and with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any further discussion on the en bloc amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Thompson is recognized.
my amendment to the en bloc amendment seeks to improve employee engagement at DHS by authorizing leadership development, rotational opportunities, as well as an employee engagement steering committee. It is critical for DHS to support the 2024 240,000 men and women who dedicate their lives to protecting us. With that goal in mind, my amendment codifies a range of activities underway at the department to enhance opportunities for advancement and training, recognize achievement, and promote retention. My amendment seeks to promote greater transparency and fairness within DHS's disciplinary process by directing an independent department-wide review of how discipline is applied by components. My amendment includes language endorsed by AFSCME, the National Border Patrol Council, NTEU, and passed by this committee. I appreciate the support of this amendment in moving the DHS workforce in a positive direction, and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the en bloc amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the en bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the en bloc amendment is agreed to. There are no additional amendments listed on the roster to Title I. Are there any further amendments to Title I of the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none, we will move on to consideration of amendments to Title II. I now call up Title II of the amendment in the nature of a substitute for consideration. We have agreement on a number of amendments to Title II, so pursuant to the chairman's previous announcement, I ask unanimous consent to consider the following amendments en bloc. Mr. Duncan, 022. Ms. Jackson Lee, 101. Mr. Correa, 006. Mr. Correa, 003. Mr. Correa, 010. Mr. Correa, 007. Mr. Correa, 014. Without objection, so ordered, the clerk shall report the en bloc amendment.
En bloc amendment offered by Mr. McCall to the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
The objection reading is dispensed with. Does any member with an amendment included in the en bloc wish to be recognized? Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first amendment authorizing the Joint Requirement Council, JRC, to identify, prioritize, and recommend investments to address cross-department capabilities. Second amendment ensures that acquisition decision makers at the department take into account the full cost of acquisitions. Third amendment authorizes the Undersecretary of Management to designate an individual within the department to be responsible for acquisition innovation initiatives. This third amendment highlights a bright spot in DHS's acquisition shop, namely the Procurement Innovation Lab. Fourth amendment ensures that DHS employs due diligence regarding the credentialing of a contractor, including their past performance. What we want to do is assure that no time is wasted or no resources by engaging a contractor with a bad performance history. Fifth Amendment improves the underlying bill by authorizing DHS to provide enhanced scrutiny for acquisitions that may not meet the $300 million threshold. That is to be a major acquisition, but nonetheless are important to the mission of DHS. Appreciate the support on these amendments, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the en bloc amendment? Ms. Watson-Coleman is recognized.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, are you still doing en bloc, or are you doing individual ones yet? En bloc?
En bloc.
I'm not.
Lady yields back. Any further discussion on the en bloc amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the en bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the en bloc amendment is agreed to. Per the roster agreement listed next on the roster is amendment number 3, offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vela. Would the ranking member like to offer the amendment?
Yes, I would, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vela had an emergency back in his district, and otherwise he would have been here to present his amendment. Mr. Chairman,
The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2825, offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. Mr. Thompson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you know very well how Texans hold private property rights in very high regard. I and a number of other individuals know several landowners who can trace their family land back 300 years to the original Spanish land grants. In a rush to score political points and build a wall, this president has threatened the private property rights of Texans and others who stand in the way of his senseless plan to build a wall. President Trump's budget includes funding for 20 additional attorneys to pursue taking through eminent domain, private property, and land necessary to build a wall along the southwest border. This is a clear sign that he will stop at nothing, even if it means taking away land held for generations by law-abiding citizens. As members of Congress and members of this committee, we have a duty to ensure that eminent domain authority to seize private land is not abused. My amendment would prevent such abuse. Specifically, my amendment would require the Department of Homeland Security to certify the necessity of land seizures and provide evidence that no other alternatives exist before exercising eminent domain. To add an additional level of protection to law-abiding citizens, my amendment requires the Comptroller General, who is impervious to political pressure, to evaluate the sufficiency of the certification. Mr. Chairman, my amendment is a simple and necessary check on the federal government, whose team of lawyers is always gearing up to take on mostly small family land owners along the border. Support private property and support private landowners, as well as Mr. Valer's support for this amendment, which, as I said earlier, he would have offered for himself, but an emergency back in his district prevented it. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Chair recognizes himself. This amendment, while well-intentioned, violates the DHS reauthorization memorandum of understanding signed by myself and seven other chairmen with jurisdiction. Specifically, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has raised both jurisdictional and substance concerns with this amendment. There is concern that the amendment expands real property authority of the department. Generally, real property authority for the government is under GSA's and thus T&I's purview. This amendment appears to be drafted to be an impediment to the construction of any wall on the border, but it is drafted so broadly that it applies to every single major acquisition by the department. The department also has significant concerns with this amendment. They believe it would particularly be burdensome and would leave DHS and CBP open to second guessing and legal challenges in the exercises of its eminent domain authority. This amendment requires the Secretary to notify the appropriate congressional committees prior to exercising eminent domain and requires congressional justification from DHS before eminent domain is used in any major acquisition program. This provision would apply across all agencies of the department, not just CBP, and to projects that may have no nexus to border security. This congressional notification requirement significantly hinders the department's ability to move forward on acquisition programs in an expeditious manner and unnecessarily limits the department's legal authority to exercise eminent domain in accordance with existing statute. I would ask members to oppose the amendment. Is there any further discussion of the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Thompson. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Pursuant to previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. Per the roster agreement listed next is Amendment 031, offered by the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman. Would the gentlelady like to offer her amendment?
Well, thank you. Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk in which I have it considered at this time.
The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2825, offered by Mrs. Watson Coleman.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and Ms. Watson Coleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the election of Donald J. Trump has set this nation into uncharted waters. For the first time in our nation's history, the man that sits in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue stands to profit mightily from his position in ways that Americans may never know. It is hard to know all of President Trump's business interests and subsidies since, as a privately held company, the Trump Organization does not have to disclose its financial information to the public. CNN estimates that President has an ownership interest in more than 500 companies, but without seeing his tax returns, it is hard to know the truth. Despite promises to walk away from his interests in the Trump Organization, this president continues to maintain a significant financial interest in the company, and everyone knows it. As such, it is not so outlandish to envision decision makers in federal agencies steering acquisitions or lodging conventions or other hospitality contracting opportunities to a Trump property or Trump company in an effort to curry favor with this president. My amendment would ensure the DHS guards against such behavior by having a management directive in place to ensure the DHS personnel do not expend taxpayer dollars on acquisitions, lodging, and other hospitality services from any entity that is owned or controlled by this president or any president. This amendment seeks to bolster integrity and sends a strong message about how we expect our government to behave in the age of Trump or any succeeding president. I urge the passage of this amendment, and I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Perry is recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Seems to me this committee has a track record of working in a strong and collegial bipartisan manner on acquisition reform. And in my opinion, the gentlelady's amendment strays from this collegial effort in an attempt to what I think is a hyperbolic political statement. There are already a variety of laws and regulations that dictate standards for expenses when government employees travel, such as the Federal Travel Regulation, which is administered by the GSA. Now, this amendment would add even more bureaucratic red tape and burdensome regulations to the agency and their employees as they go to perform simple tasks like booking a hotel room. Now, as many people know, I've been critical, and rightly so, on many occasions, but I don't think they need another hoop to jump through just to do a simple job. It's also unclear, and I think this is important, who the amendment would apply to, as the term acquisition workforce of the department, and quote that, is not really defined. So we need to know who we're talking about here, and it's important when we say things, words mean things and laws mean things. I think that knowing the threats of our nation and what we're facing is a far better place for DHS employees to spend their time protecting our homeland, protecting us, rather than researching who may own or not own a catering service or the hotel down the street so that they can book a room so they can do their work. And I would just urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
The ranking member is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I support the gentlelady's amendment. We should not stand by and allow this president or any president to line his pockets with American tax dollars. The prospect that the Trump administration would create a culture within the executive branch where there is expectations that decision makers will steer contract or lodging and hospitality services to the Trump Organization is not remote. This president has a record of playing fast and loose when it comes to his business interests. Just consider how he took $300 million in loan from Deutsche Bank, the same bank that in January settled a long-standing federal civil suit with the Justice Department for selling toxic mortgage-backed securities that contributed mightily to the 2008 financial crisis. As you have seen, and have you seen his tax returns? Me neither. Have you seen documents showing that he divested his interests in the Trump Organization? Me neither. This president may be unpredictable when it comes to foreign policy, but when it comes to caring about money, he has been remarkably consistent. As Representative Watson Coleman aptly stated, we are in uncharted waters. Never before have we had to be concerned about the prospect that the federal acquisition process might be exploited to enrich a president. Further, what assurances do we have that there will not be pressure, either overtly or covertly, on federal workers to cut great deals with the Trump organization or one of its estimated 500 or so subsidiaries when much of the president's family, including his daughter, son-in-law, and former business associates, are involved in the administration? The fact that this president has issued so many ethical waivers to his staff compounds this concern. While we cannot eliminate the risk across the federal government, we have an opportunity today to make sure that one federal department, which has a budget of around $42 billion, provide its people some guidance to avoid enriching this president. I urge support for the Watson-Coleman amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment?
Roger, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Garrett is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move unanimous consent to have 4 letters entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Speaking in opposition to the amendment, it strikes...
Would the gentleman state the letter's content?
They're on the subject matter. Hang on one second, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to need to chase them down. From the Project Management Institute, also one from the Alliance for the Public Sector, also a letter from the American Conservative Union, also a letter from Business Executives for National Security, that they all be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speaking in opposition to the amendment.
Yeah, the gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, open source and well-documented information indicates that the net worth of the previous administration was about $3 million upon entering the White House, and upon departing the White House was in excess of $12 million. And yet, there's no vitriol or rancor stemming forth from this side of the aisle seeking to explain the fact that the net worth of an individual whose salary would have totaled only a fraction of that had increased so substantially during their period in the executive mansion. It strikes me as unfortunate that the political tone, even on a day such as this, has deteriorated to the level that innuendo, without any basis in fact or support, is offered as testimony before this committee. If, in fact, members of this committee have evidence that members of the executive branch have been cajoled, coerced, or in other ways encouraged to steer U.S. taxpayer dollars inappropriately towards the enterprises of Mr. Trump, I ask them to come forward with it today so that I can join them in condemning that. However, Mr. Chairman, none of that information exists. It seems to me that if an individual engages in the business endeavor of perhaps creating something that one might use in the everyday course of life, for example, bar soap or toothpaste or a hotel chain or automobiles, that they shouldn't be precluded then from hoping to serve their nation in a higher capacity because of the fact that one group seeking to score partisan points might make that creation the object of a political discourse. Mr. Chairman, I think it's a good thing that our current chief executive isn't an interest holder in Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or the Ford Motor Company or Google or Microsoft, because we'd have to reprocure almost everything the federal government already has. As it stands, there are hotels. Members of the executive branch will use hotels, and if anyone can demonstrate that this has been done in any way, shape, or form with the undue influence of the administration, there is a cause of action to be pursued, but this amendment, Mr. Chairman, is not the appropriate remedy. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Payne is recognized.
I yield my time to the ranking member, Mr. Thompson.
Mr. Thompson is recognized.
Thank you very much. To the gentleman previously who spoke, all we looking for is the taxes. If you give us the taxes, we might find interest in Lockheed Martin. We might find interest in Google. But in absence of seeing any of this information, I think any opinion is just an opinion. As an attorney, I'm sure, and I do know you recognize the fact that we have to provide certain information, and I think it's applicable for the president to provide similar information. So if we look at the information, nothing there, no harm done. But the fact that this information is not being made available to us is a problem, and that is why I support Ms. Watson's-Coleman amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Chair recognizes himself. This amendment violates the DHS reauthorization memorandum of understanding signed by myself and the 7 other chairmen with jurisdiction. The Transportation Infrastructure Committee has expressed concerns regarding this implicating their jurisdiction. And pursuant to the MOU regarding the authorization bill process, we cannot accept an amendment that falls in another committee's jurisdiction without their agreement. So for that reason, I would ask that the members oppose this amendment. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Watson-Coleman. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to have a recorded vote on this amendment, please.
A recorded vote's been requested pursuant to the previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. There are no additional amendments listed on the roster to Title II. Are there any further amendments to Title II of the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none, we will now move on to consideration of amendments to Title III. I now call up Title III of the amendment in the nature of a substitute for consideration. We have agreement on a number of amendments to Title III. So pursuant to the chairman's previous announcement, I ask unanimous consent to consider the following amendments en bloc. Mr. King, 023. Mr. Thompson, 017. Mr. Hurd, 7. Ms. Jackson Lee, 106 as modified. Mr. Fitzpatrick, 052. And Mr. Langevin, 025. Without objection, so ordered, the clerk shall report the en bloc amendment.
En bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2825, offered by Mr. McCall.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. Does any member with an amendment, including the en bloc, wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. King is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll make my remarks brief, and I appreciate the fact that this is part of the en bloc amendment and is expected to be approved. So I'll keep my remarks very brief. But basically, this legislation requires the DHS Secretary to conduct a threat assessment on whether human smuggling organizations and transnational gangs are exploiting vulnerabilities in border security screening programs to enter into the United States. What has prompted me to bring about this amendment specifically is the upsurge in MS-13 activity in my district, where 17 people have been murdered by MS-13 in just the last year alone, most occurring within 20 minutes of my home. This is terrorizing the immigrant community. It's terrorizing the minority community in places such as Central Islip, Brentwood in particular, also parts of Copiague. Now, just back in March of this year, March 2nd, 2017, 13 MS-13 members were charged federally with racketeering, 7 murders, narcotics violations, and other offenses. 7 of the 13 gang members charged on that date entered the United States through the Unaccompanied Alien Children Services Program. I think it's important that the DHS Secretary look into that program to see what greater precautions can be put into it. I have been advised by the police commissioner in Suffolk County of the information he has, which is shown to me, where it appears that MS-13 is to some extent gaming the system. And nobody wants to cause any undue anguish or harm to young children, but it is important that at the very least, when it comes to monitoring of families, for instance, that be done in a much more selective way, much more sophisticated way. So these are issues that I think should be brought to the Secretary, and there should be a threat assessment done. Again, I'm not going to go on at length today. I just want to thank the committee for their support. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member for the support you've given, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Any other member wish to be recognized in the en bloc amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Langevin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief as well. Mr. Chairman, the amendment that I have in the en bloc package pertains to Fusion Center personnel and is based on feedback that I've received regarding the effective use of Fusion Centers to combat cybersecurity threats. So Fusion Centers have proven to be effective tools for sharing counterterrorism information, and it's only logical that we use the infrastructure for the sharing of cyber threat data as appropriate. So Fusion Centers are also important because they allow states the flexibility to tailor operating models based on the state's individual needs. For instance, I come from the biggest little state in the Union, and while we have may have outsized pride for Rhode Island, we simply don't have the population to support a statewide cyber threat center separate and apart from our existing Fusion Center. So that's why Governor Raimondo's Cybersecurity Commission, led by my good friend Scott DePasquale, made a number of recommendations about utilizing Fusion Center resources to improve the state's cyber posture. As with many challenges in cybersecurity, the problem in implementing these recommendations is one of workforce. So from discussions with our state's Joint Cyber Task Force, I've learned that DHS has been reluctant to assign cyber analysts from the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications and the NCIC to Fusion Centers. So as the hub of cyber information sharing in the government, it seems only natural that NCIC analysts should be able to rotate through Fusion Centers as appropriate, and my amendment will explicitly include authority for DHS to make these assignments. So I hope this amendment will help make clear to the Department that officers from CNS&C can and should play an important role in Fusion Centers focused on cybersecurity, and I urge its adoption as part of the en bloc package. I thank the Chairman for his support and the Ranking Member, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the en bloc amendment? Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment will require the Secretary to promote and facilitate to the greatest extent practicable nationwide SAR suspicious activity training to fire, EMS, emergency management, and public health officials. The nationwide suspicious activity reporting initiative, which is run in partnership with the Department of Homeland Security and the National Network of Fusion Centers, provides first responders with training on how to properly report suspicious behavior that might have a potential nexus to terrorism. And at a time where our threat environment is at the highest level since 9/11 and lone wolf attacks are increasingly becoming the new normal, it's imperative that all of our first responders are trained in prevention activities and who know who to call when they see something suspicious or suspicious behavior. As a first responder myself, I believe that the more people that are trained in SAR reporting, the safer our communities will be. I urge its adoption, and Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your support.
The gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the en bloc amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the en bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the en bloc amendment is agreed to. There are no additional amendments listed on the roster to Title III. Are there any further amendments to Title III? Hearing none, we will move on to consideration of the amendments to Title IV. I now call up Title IV, the amendment in the nature of a substitute, for consideration. It's my understanding we have an agreement on the two amendments to Title IV. So pursuant to the chairman's previous announcement, I ask unanimous consent to consider the Rutherford 008 and Korea 011 amendments en bloc. And without objection, so order. The clerk shall report the en bloc amendment.
En bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2825, offered by Mr. McCall.
All right, without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Does either member wish, with an amendment included in the en bloc, wish to be recognized? Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is a simple yet important one. It would direct DHS to submit a report to Congress, us, detailing its specific resources and assets in maritime space. As we know, the men and women of the Coast Guard do a commendable work, especially in stopping drugs coming into our country. Yet the Coast Guard continues to endure tough budget situations. Mr. Chairman, I was shocked to learn here in this committee from Commandant Admiral Zunkenfeld that the Coast Guard last year could not stop almost 600 drug shipments by sea because they did not have the assets to intercept them. Mr. Chairman, if we really want to stop drugs from reaching our shores, let our spending priorities reflect such. We are spending $20 billion on a wall that was started in 1992 in the name of stopping drugs, yet we know that most of the drugs hitting our country come through our ports. Let's give the Coast Guard the resources they need. Specifically, my amendment directs DHS to report the total number of assets and personnel in each transit zone, as well as how many known drug-related actions were given a pass. Most importantly, DHS is directed to provide information on how many personnel and assets would be required to do their job in a satisfactory way. I urge my colleague to support my amendment, and I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the en bloc amendment? Mr. Rutherford is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Correa, for offering this valuable amendment to highlight really a critical maritime resource shortage in that transit zone, those vast areas of the Caribbean and Pacific Ocean where massive uncut drug loads move over the waters to U.S. shores. The U.S. Coast Guard is the lead DHS agency tasked with interdicting these illicit activities in the transit zone. Coast Guard Vice Admiral Charles Ray testified before this committee, in fact, in February, stating that with the current force laydown and current resource constraints, that the Coast Guard is only able to interdict 30% of the known illicit drugs moving through that transit zone. My colleagues' reporting requirements will provide a very valuable addition to matrices already required by the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act to identify the number of assets and personnel required to increase the department's interdiction rate of known illicit activity within the transit zone. These matrices not only will formally highlight the massive resource deficit in the transit zone, but will also assist in advocating for vital current and future acquisition projects undertaken by the Department of Homeland Security in an effort to secure our maritime borders and prevent thousands of tons of illicit narcotics from reaching our shores. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the en bloc amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the en bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the en bloc amendment is agreed to. There are no additional amendments listed on the roster to Title IV. Are there any further amendments to Title IV? Hearing none, we will now move on to consideration of amendments to Title V. I now call up Title V of the amendment in the nature of a substitute for consideration. We have agreement on a number of amendments to Title V. So pursuant to the chairman's previous announcement, I ask unanimous consent to consider the following amendments en bloc. Rogers 005, Thompson 019, Catco 4, Catco 12, Watson Coleman number 9, Watson Coleman number 10, Watson Coleman number 5A, Donovan number 013, Rice number 017, Rice number 016, Rice number 004, Gallagher number 4, Demings number 13, Garrett number 5, Berrigan number 12. Without objection, so ordered. The clerk shall report the en bloc amendment.
En bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 2825, offered by Mr. McCall.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Does any member with an amendment, including the en bloc, wish to be recognized? Ms. Watson-Coleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have 3 amendments at the desk and wish to be recognized.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, my first amendment seeks to enhance the security of public areas of transportation facilities through the establishment of a working group between DHS and public and private stakeholders. I am troubled by the recent frequency of attacks in public areas. In recent years, we have seen deadly attacks on public airport areas in Fort Lauderdale, Los Angeles, Brussels, and Istanbul. Terrorists have attacked mass transit venues overseas and could target such systems in the United States. We must remain a step ahead of these wishing to do harm and work to secure such systems. TSA has taken a step in the right direction by convening industry, government, academia, and other stakeholders to discuss public area security and develop a national framework to secure public areas. My amendment would ensure that work continues, and it would require TSA to make available a framework for establishing operations centers within transportation facilities to promote interagency response and coordination. Finally, my amendment would require TSA to review regulations regarding the transportation of firearms and ammunition by aircraft passengers. In March, I received a letter from the TSA on regulations regarding firearms and ammunition, which states, quote, "We fully agree with you. A more effective approach that involves a comprehensive strategy to improve the overall posture of public area security is needed and is presently being developed. I would ask that the letter that I have here be entered into the record."
Without objection, so
Thank you,
ordered.
Mr. Chairman. My second amendment would codify TSA's Innovation Task Force, a public-private partnership to help identify and pilot innovative security technologies. The amendment would authorize the task force to conduct field demonstrations and gather performance data on new technologies and capabilities to inform the acquisition process. The amendment also authorizes TSA to provide funding to small businesses so that they too can participate in the task force. Since creating the task force last year, TSA has collaborated with airports, airlines, technology companies, and other stakeholders to deploy new technologies at several airports across the country. Currently, TSA is operating 67 automated screening lanes around the country, including 17 at my home state airport, Newark Liberty International. These lanes help improve security and passenger flow. While the task force is still in its infancy, it is well positioned to make significant improvements to passenger screening. This amendment will support those efforts. My third amendment authorizes TSA to maintain 30 visible intermodal prevention and response, or VIPER teams, which are comprised of TSA assets such as federal air marshals and transportation security inspectors and officers. These teams are deployed to support local, state, and federal law enforcement efforts to secure transportation facilities. Last year, Congress authorized funding for up to 60 VIPER teams nationwide, an increase from TSA's previous deployment of 31. Despite this congressional support for the program, the President's budget proposes to cut the program to just 8 teams. Given current threats, this is unacceptable. VIPER teams provide some of the most mobile and visible tools available to address some of the most pressing threats, including threats to public airport areas and secure areas where insiders threaten to do harm. Importantly, VIPER teams are perhaps the best and most visible tools for securing service transportation as they deploy to mass transit and passenger rail hubs. The underlying bill requires TSA to develop performance measures and objectives to assess the effectiveness of the program. I support that provision, and my amendment directs TSA to report to Congress on the appropriate number of VIPER teams after creating the performance measures. My amendment also provides flexibility for TSA to reduce the number of VIPER teams if the administrator determines that federal air marshals assigned to VIPER teams must be reassigned and deployed to other missions to address current threats. These 3 amendments are common sense measures that will improve transportation security, and I thank you and my colleagues for their support. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion on the en bloc amendment? Mr. Berrigan, Ms. Berrigan is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at this time and wish to have it considered. Let's see.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment authorizes funding for the reimbursement of armed law enforcement personnel at airports, which the President's budget would which would eliminate. In recent years, the frequency of terrorist attacks and mass shootings at airports has increased at an alarming rate. In the U.S., attackers have opened fire on innocent travelers in my home airport, LAX, as well as in baggage claim area at the Fort Lauderdale Airport. Over the past 2 years, terrorists have also carried out devastating attacks abroad, most notably in Istanbul, Turkey, and Brussels, Belgium. Law enforcement patrols are necessary to prevent attacks, and when an attack occurs, quick law enforcement response is critical to saving lives. Additionally, TSA relies on local police to help handle dangerous or suspicious items at security checkpoints, including the record number of 3,391 firearms found in carry-on bags last year. Eliminating funding for this program would harm security, so I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Rice is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first amendment would require the department to conduct a cybersecurity assessment of the databases for TSA's trusted traveler and credentialing programs and report to Congress on any vulnerabilities they find. Millions of people participate in the TSA's PreCheck, Transportation Worker Identification Credential, Hazmat Credential, and Airport SIDA badge programs. To do so, they give TSA their most sensitive personal information and even biometrics. As the 2015 data breach of the Office of Personnel Management illustrated, federal networks are treasure troves of valuable, personally identifiable information for cyber criminals and other cyber attackers. That's why it's crucial that DHS take every precaution to protect the sensitive passenger and transportation worker information housed in TSA databases, and my amendment will make sure that DHS works proactively to protect this information. My second amendment requires the TSA administrator to update Congress annually instead of biannually about the status of TSA's 5-year technology investment plan, to notify Congress, airports, and airlines of any change made to the plan no later than 90 days after the change is made, and to provide this committee with a report disclosing any TSA equipment that is in operation after the end of its life cycle or the end of the useful life projection for the equipment. These requirements will provide much-needed clarity and transparency as TSA pursues their 5-year investment plan and give businesses big and small the certainty they need to work with the federal government. This amendment is identical to H.R. 1353, legislation I introduced that passed the House in March with overwhelming bipartisan support, and I urge you to support it again today. Finally, my third amendment will codify important reforms that the DHS Inspector General recommended in 2015 after finding that TSA lacks adequate policies and processes to maintain essential airport security equipment. Failure to conduct routine maintenance of sensitive security technology threatens to reduce the equipment's lifespan. If equipment becomes less than fully operational because of a lack of regular maintenance, TSA will have to incur the cost to replace it, and in the meantime, they'll be forced to rely on other screening measures that are less effective at detecting dangerous items. This amendment will require the TSA administrator to develop and implement a preventative maintenance process for security-related technology with specific schedules, guidance for TSA personnel and contractors on how to conduct and document maintenance actions, mechanisms to ensure compliance, and penalties for noncompliance. I urge all my colleagues to support these amendments, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any other member wish to be recognized on the en bloc amendment? Ms. Demings is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Per the roster agreement, I have an amendment at the desk and wish to have it considered at this time.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you so much. A few short weeks ago, President Trump, in his first budget, called for transitioning almost 1,100 TSA officers currently staffing airport exit lanes to security checkpoints. The elimination of exit lane staffing in budget proposals is problematic for a few reasons. First, exit lane staffing responsibilities and expenses would be shifted to local airport authorities who simply do not have the resources to undertake such a change. Second, elimination of such staffing directly contradicts statutory language contained in the bipartisan budget agreement of 2013 that requires TSA to monitor passenger exit lanes for the sterile area of airports. There is no question about it. TSA is responsible for exit lane staffing. Eliminating exit lane staffing does not enhance our nation's security, and to do so would be a dereliction of duty by TSA as mandated by Congress. Today, in this committee, we can tell the administration that we will not stand for TSA taking its congressionally mandated duties and moving them to cash-strapped locals. My amendment, co-sponsored by the gentleman of Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, would authorize funding at the same level of fiscal year 2017 for exit lane coverage through fiscal year 2019. I encourage my colleagues to support our airports by requiring TSA to continue to do its job and staff exit lanes. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I do yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any other member wish to be recognized on the en bloc amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the en bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the en bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. Per the roster agreement listed next is amendment number 2, offered by the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson. Would the gentleman like to offer his amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment listed on the roster and ask for its consideration at this time.
The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 2825, offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. Mr. Thompson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is simple. TSA needs the proper resources to be able to invest in its staff and technology and make measurable improvements. My amendment, which is based off the bill I've crafted with the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee ranking member Peter DeFazio and Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman, will allow TSA to retain the $1.28 billion in fees it collects so it can properly staff airports around the country, operate as effectively as possible, and help secure our skies. One of the largest resource gaps TSA faces is due to the fact that over $1 billion of these fees it collects from travelers is being diverted away from the aviation security and instead being used toward deficit reduction. The need is great. Just last week, the committee heard from DHS Secretary John Kelly, who testified before the committee that the threat of aviation remains high and criminals and terrorists continue to target airlines and airports. I've heard from a number of industry stakeholders who are concerned about the continued diversion of these resources and the impact of not allowing the agency that collects the security fees to actually use them to further their mission. My amendment is supported by the Airports Council International, International Air Transport Association, and the Airlines for America. The issue of passenger security fees is a bipartisan issue. I would note that Section 523 of the underlying bill specifically prohibits TSA from proposing an increase in the passenger security fee. While I support that provision, I cannot help but think that TSA would not be soliciting a fee increase if they got the money, keep the money that they collected. I understand that there are some on the other side of the aisle that agree with me, but will be voting no out of concern that if passed, House leadership will not let the bill advance to the floor. I'd say to those members, if we get a strong vote today, your leadership will take notice and have to come around. They did it when it became the bipartisan budget caps on defense spending. I encourage my colleagues to join me in ensuring that TSA receives the resources it needs to effectively protect our transportation system and spend the money it's already collecting rather than going to deficit reduction. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ranking member yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Ms. I didn't see. Ms. Jackson-Lee?
I'm trying to speak on the en bloc, number 6. Pardon me?
We're not on that.
I support Mr. Thompson's amendment. I yield back.
Okay. Mr. Payne is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's kind of tough there. But we're all together. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak in support of Mr. Thompson's amendment. The aviation threat is too high to divert funding from security we hear from DHS time and time again is that the aviation threat remains high. The threat is so high that we're banning laptops in the cabin of airplanes from the EU has been under consideration for months. Now is not the time to withhold $1 billion from TSA. The bad guys are not out there every day planning to wreak havoc on our aviation system, and for us to have a debate on whether or not we should keep allowing the diversion of over $1 billion in aviation security fees to be spent on some combination of unrelated spending is a complete mismanagement of priorities. I support the Thompson Amendment and encourage members to vote yes, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be recognized? Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am going to speak in support of this amendment. I also want to seek unanimous consent to introduce into this record 3 letters in support of this amendment. Airport Council International, IATA, and last but not least, Airlines for America.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We are in the summer travel season, and during this time, it is especially important that TSA has the resources necessary to ensure effective and efficient security screening. Yet we sit here today knowing that every year $1.28 billion walks away from TSA from the security fees that they don't get to reinvest for needed projects and the execution of this core function. And this happens on an annual basis. In April, the Subcommittee on Transportation and Protective Security held a hearing looking at security screening technology improvements. One thing was very clear to me from our hearing was that if TSA had more resources, that it would be able to devote to improve technologies, then not only will the passenger flying experience be improved, but our skies would also be safer. The security fees consumers pay on each ticket should be dedicated to just that, security. Diverting these funds to other budget problems is a gimmick, and the committee should instead pass this amendment so that these fees are used in line with their original purpose, protecting America's travelers. With that, Mr. Chairman, I support the amendment and yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I yield to my colleague.
You yielded back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Well, let me thank the gentlelady for attempting to yield back, and thank the chairman very much. The gentlelady just caused me with the submission of letters from the Airport Council, reminded me that we'll be hosting a number of airport entities in Houston this weekend. And it seems quite contradictory to place on airports, airlines, the traveling public, the burden of their safety, and then take the very dollars that were supposed to be utilized. And so I just want to put into the record to refresh the memories of our colleagues, but to support Mr. Thompson's amendment of the importance of the use of aviation or airline security fees for security. Just remind us of the LAX shooting incident that killed Geraldo Hernandez, who became the first TSA officer killed in the line of duty, and the machete attack at the Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport that resulted in injuries to senior transportation security officer Carol Rochelle. The other is that if you speak to TSOs and their management, they will indicate that there are times that they have to close certain checkpoints or have shortened or less staff because of resources that are so desperately needed. And I'd like to add as well that any enhanced training that TSOs and that the TSA can utilize will further protect the traveling public. Mr. Thompson's amendment is timely, and certainly as we reflect on today, which I'll comment on just a little bit later, this is a very important amendment, and I thank the gentleman for offering it, support it, and yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Does any other member wish to be recognized? Ms. Berrigan's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to also express my support for this. The other day, I was listening to Secretary Kelly talk actually about the aviation threat being high. He made a comment, and he said, the idea of airplane attacks keeps me literally awake at night. If that's not a statement about the high level of aviation threat, I don't know what is, that it keeps him awake at night. I also heard in another interview he referenced of how the terrorists really would love to get one of our planes, which is the basis for the laptop ban, and says we're just, one plane attack away. I think that the funding is so critical for TSA, and I just wanted to express my support of this amendment. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. Does any other member wish to be recognized? Chair recognizes himself. This amendment, it's well-intentioned. No one understands the aviation threat, I think, better than I do. However, this amendment undoes the Ryan Murray Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013, which increased discretionary spending caps, raised revenue, and expected to lower the deficit by $23 billion over 10 years. The effect of this amendment would mean that this vital reauthorization bill would not be able to go to the floor with this amendment included due to a budget point of order, and therefore I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. Is there any other further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Thompson. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a
Recorded vote has been requested pursuant to the previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. There are no additional amendments listed on the roster to Title V. Are there any further amendments to Title V of the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none, we will move on to consideration of amendments to Title VI. I now call up Title VI of the amendment in the nature of a substitute for consideration. We have agreement on a number of amendments. So pursuant to the chairman's previous announcement, I ask unanimous consent to consider the following amendments en bloc. McSally, number 033. Thompson, number 003. Thompson, number 018. Rutherford, number 10. Jackson Lee, number 104. Jackson Lee, number 105. Garrett, number 9. Langevin, number 001. Langevin, Amendment 001. Payne, number 002. And Demings, number 010. Without objection, so ordered, the clerk shall report the en bloc amendment.
En bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2825, offered by Mr. McCall.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Does any member with an amendment included in the en bloc wish to be recognized? Ms. Watson, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to, before I begin, to acknowledge again the actions and tragic shootings today of our colleagues, the Majority Whip Scalise and the volunteer and staff that was with him, as well as the Capitol Hill police officers that were mentioned on the floor today. I think it is very important that we, as we work today, that this day be a day of reflection and prayer, and certainly offer our prayers for the recovery of Congressman Scalise. But I think there's been a theme that I believe is very important as I briefly take note. This committee is the Homeland Security Committee, and though there are many jurisdictional committees, House Administration members are discussing and interested in how they proceed, not so much to protect themselves as often is done, but their families, their offices, their staff. All of us will be engaging with our district staff. I think it is important that this committee have an opportunity to discuss this issue at some point because it deals with Homeland Security, and we're so much reminded of the tragedy that affected Gabby Giffords, who I was with this past weekend in the naming of the USS Gabrielle Giffords. So I hope prayerfully that we will continue today. Many have talked about the tone, and I would only say that this is what a democracy is. It allows us to be passionate in our debate, but not to be violent. And if we're dealing with individuals who may be listening, we must find a way to heal the nation, but also to answer their pain. So as we discuss reauthorizing this legislation, it reinforces the importance of this committee and the work that we do, and now it seems that it impacts members of Congress again. We don't often speak of ourselves, but we're concerned about those around us. And I would hope that we would have that opportunity. I want to take note of the amendments that have been previously passed in the en bloc. Jackson Lee amendment in en bloc that adds to the mission of the DHS agency that deals with civil liberties and civil rights, reinforcing that. Jackson Lee Amendment number 2 that was an en bloc number 2, Jackson Lee Amendment number 3 that was an en bloc number 3. Those amendments deal with improving technology in DHS, and then as well they deal with the fusion centers, which I think are so very crucial in our respective districts. We're now at en bloc number 6, and I want to specifically discuss those amendments. It adds to the list of DHS components such as the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, TSA, Coast Guard, emergency communications, emergency management, state and local law enforcement, countering violent extremism, which can enter into memorandums of understanding to include, through this amendment, the Chief Medical Officer. I also want to acknowledge Jackson Lee Amendment number 5, which is an en bloc. It assures the language was changed, but in coordination with the appropriate department, component agencies and offices and federal agencies develop, keep up to date, and make available information on federal resources intended to support fusion centers' access to agency data. And I am very pleased that the ranking member and chairman has allowed my bill, the First Statement and Local Law Enforcement Act, to be, in the nature of a substitute, to be included in the Homeland Security Reauthorization Act of 2017. And that bill, of course, supports transparency and oversight of the work of the DHS Office of State and Local Law Enforcement by requiring that an annual report of its activities be provided to the United States Congress. This office is a primary coordinator between state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement. This is a very important committee. I'm very glad that we are doing this work. The department has not been reauthorized for a period of time. This is constructive and important, and I hope that we will continue in this work that we're doing, that the depth of our reach of security will enhance the security of the American people, but also will enhance the security of those of us who are entrusted to serve this nation every single day. Each of us, regardless of party, are here to serve the American people. I ask support of the en bloc and all the other amendments. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any other member wish to be recognized? Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On Amendment 10, I recently had a opportunity to participate in a roundtable held by the Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Communications and the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism and Intelligence. And this roundtable was an opportunity for members of the law enforcement community to voice their concerns and share ways to better ensure their jurisdictions are safe and resilient in the face of modern-day threats. One of the main issues discussed by the law enforcement stakeholders at this roundtable was a sentiment that FEMA does not adequately take into account law enforcement community in their program and policy development. My amendment seeks to help resolve this. By authorizing the senior law enforcement advisor under FEMA, we ensure that the law enforcement stakeholders have a voice at FEMA. We codify in law that our law enforcement community is embedded in the emergency planning, guidance, training, and management at FEMA. Whether it is preparing communities for another hurricane season, directing evacuations during floods, or securing a scene after an attack by an improvised explosive device, law enforcement is, of course, a vital component of our first responder community. This position enhances the experience and resources that the administrator can call upon to support first responders across disciplines. We must recognize the important role played by law enforcement and ensure their voices are heard at FEMA. And I urge all members to support my amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the en bloc amendment? Mr. Longevin's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two amendments that are included in the en bloc package. My first amendment would formally authorize the Office of Disability Integration and Coordination into law. Since the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act established the Disability Coordinator within the Federal Emergency Management Agency, we've witnessed an important change in how emergency plans address individuals with disabilities. Where once emergency preparedness for the disability community seemed to be an afterthought, addressed through additional guidance in the form of annexes and supplemental plans, we have now begun to see more inclusive emergency planning. Emergency managers are beginning to include protocols for those who face accessibility challenges right from the start. And a good deal of the progress we've seen can be attributed to FEMA's Office of Disability Integration and Coordination, which offers information, guidance, and assistive devices before and during disasters to ensure that emergency service providers and shelters meet the needs of everyone in their communities. In addition to a small headquarters staff, there's a regional disability integration specialist in each FEMA region who works with state, local, tribal, and territorial partners to ensure emergency planning is in fact inclusive. ODIC has also developed and conducted training courses to promote disability inclusive management, assessed FEMA disaster recovery centers for accessibility, and advised joint field offices during coordinated disaster responses. There are tens of millions of adults and children living with disabilities, Mr. Chairman, in the United States, and we are better for the innumerable contributions they make to our communities. Ensuring that strategies for emergency response provide for this population and fostering a dialogue about how such policies can continue to evolve is crucial to protecting the safety and security of all Americans. So I'm excited to offer a way to formally authorize the ODIC so that when disaster strikes, FEMA, in collaboration with its state and local partners, will have a plan reflective of the needs of the whole community. Mr. Chairman, my second amendment in the en bloc package deals with the cybersecurity grant funding. So the amendment in the nature of a substitute includes language formally authorizing cybersecurity as an allowable use of the State Homeland Security Program and the Urban Area Security Initiative. As my fellow co-chair of the Congressional Cybersecurity Caucus, Mr. Chairman, I know that it will come as no surprise to you that I support this effort to emphasize cybersecurity in the Homeland Security grant programs. That said, I would note that cybersecurity has long been an allowable use for Homeland Security grant funds, yet we do not see grantees spending their money to address the threats posed in this new domain. So I believe expanding awareness within the state and local governments is definitely a factor. However, there is unquestionably some level of understanding of the cybersecurity risk exposure, as in the National Preparedness Report. Grantees continually identify cybersecurity as a core capability in which they have the least confidence. So my amendment would direct the FEMA administrator, in coordination with the relevant departmental components, to study why grantees are not investing grant dollars in building cybersecurity capabilities and to set forth a plan to encourage grantees to leverage federal dollars to better mitigate the risk. Back home in Rhode Island, Governor Raimondo has been working to develop a comprehensive cybersecurity risk management plan, first through the chartering of a statewide cybersecurity commission, and more recently through the hiring of the state's first ever cyber advisor. So I've been very pleased by the governor's efforts, as they were long overdue. We owe it to our mayors and governors to support their efforts to address this new threat, which I firmly believe is the national security challenge of the 21st century. This amendment is an important step in better understanding how to do so, and I'd like to thank the ranking member and you, Mr. Chairman, for all of the all the committee staff for their assistance on both of these amendments, and I urge their adoption as part of the en bloc package, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the en bloc amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
The ranking member is recognized.
I have two amendments. My first authorizes the nonprofit security grant program at $50 million per year. Of that 50, $35 million will be set aside for nonprofits in urban area security initiative jurisdiction, and $15 million for the nonprofit organizations outside of UASIS. It seeks to modernize and strengthen an important homeland security program. As you know, 2 summers ago, a white supremacist opened fire on a Bible study gathering at church in Charleston, South Carolina, savagely killing 9 people. In 2012, a white supremacist shot and killed 6 people and wounded 4 others at a Sikh temple shooting in Wisconsin. Regrettably, these threats to religious institutions and nonprofit organizations are not going away. Earlier this year, Jewish organizations experienced a wave of bomb threats, harassment, and vandalism. And in 2017 alone, intentional fires were set at mosques in 2 cities in Texas, Washington State, Florida, and Michigan. The threats to mosques is perceived to be so significant that Muslim advocates, a Muslim civil rights organization, cautioned mosques across the country to be on guard against acts of arson and vandalism at the start of Ramadan last month. We owe it to our constituents to ensure that the places of worship and nonprofit organizations they visit are safe and secure. That is why I'm offering this program. My second amendment would hold the Federal Emergency Management Agency accountable for implementing critical reforms to keep first responders and trainers at the Center for Domestic Preparedness safe. Late last year, we learned that CDP, which is located in Alabama, had accidentally been using a toxic form of ricin for which there is no countermeasure in its training at the Chemical Ordnance, Biological, and Radiological Training Facility for about 5 years. As authorizers, we first learned about the situation in the days leading up to the release of a USA Today story on the matter. I, along with EPRC Ranking Member Payne, Chairman McCall, and EPRC Chairman Donovan, wrote to FEMA to better understand how such a serious mistake could happen, what steps would be taken to ensure no employee or trainee had been harmed, and what FEMA is doing to prevent it from ever happening again. Last month, CDP released its Management Review Team report, which made a number of recommendations to improve governance, agency verification, contracting, and facilities management in crisis management, among others. My amendment will direct FEMA to develop an implementation plan to address these recommendations. The training carried out at the Center for Domestic Preparedness is invaluable to first responders across the country, and we have an obligation to ensure that they can train safely. With that, I urge adoption of the 2 amendments, but I also ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a letter from the Jewish Federations of North America.
Without objection, so ordered. And I support the gentleman's amendment. Is there any further discussion on the en bloc amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Payne is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, operable and interoperable communications are fundamental to any disaster response operation. We learned that lesson painfully on 9/11 and during the response to Hurricane Katrina. In the years that have passed, communities across the country have made significant progress addressing interoperable emergency communication challenges. We owe much of the progress we have made to improvements in emergency communications governance structures at the state and regional levels. Mark Grubb, now SAFECOM Vice Chair, observed when he testified before the Emergency Preparedness Subcommittee, interoperability requires much more than just equipment. It's really about people in desperate agencies and jurisdictions, including each other in their planning process. My amendment would ensure that when a state or high-risk urban area uses Homeland Security grant funds to purchase emergency communications equipment, those purchases are coordinated by state governance structures. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the en bloc amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Demings is recognized.
thank you so much. The risk formula and methodology used to inform Urban Area Security Initiative and State Homeland Security Grant Program awardees are overdue for review. Our national preparedness posture and the threat landscape have changed since the initial authorization of DHS's grant programs. This is why we need an assessment done outside of the department to evaluate whether the risk formula and methodology currently utilized by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is providing the Secretary of Homeland Security an accurate snapshot of each jurisdiction relative risks. We need to know that the best data and most thorough threat analysis is being used to inform relative risk scores, and we need to understand how risk scores translate into grant awards. My amendment would require the Government Accountability Office to review the current risk formula and methodology used for the URASI and State Homeland Security grant programs. This review would include an assessment of the process used by DHS to gather threat information, the extent to which the threat formula and methodology considers capabilities achieved, and how grant award amounts are determined, among other things. The finding from this GAO evaluation will help ensure that grant funds are provided where they are needed most. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any further discussion on the en bloc amendment? There being no further discussion, question now occurs on the en bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the en bloc amendment is agreed to. Per the roster agreement listed next on the roster is amendment number 006, offered by the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne. Would the gentleman like to offer his amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk and wish to have it considered this time.
The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2825, offered by Mr. Payne.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with, and the gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I represent the 10th Congressional District of the state of New Jersey, which includes Newark and Jersey City, the two largest municipalities in the state. On September 11, 2001, the people of northern New Jersey bore witness to the horrific attacks happening across the Hudson. Courageous first responders rushed into the Twin Towers to save as many lives as they could. In the weeks and months that followed, we learned we need to do a better job in getting our first responders access to training, exercises, and equipment to be able to respond to complex multi-jurisdictional disasters. After recognizing their heroism of the first responders that were on the scene in New York, the Pentagon, and Pennsylvania, Congress put its monies where its mouth was and authorized and funded grant programs to help state and local first responders build capabilities. In September 2016, we witnessed the benefits of these grant investments when multiple law enforcement agencies coordinated to apprehend a man who had placed a series of explosives in New York and the New Jersey area. The planning, training, and exercises supported by Urban Area Security Initiative funding and state Homeland Security grants, facilitated the quick arrest of the bombing suspect. And after the Boston Marathon bombings, law enforcement and first responders credited exercises, training, and interoperable communications advances supported by UASI and state Homeland Security grants for the successful response. Unfortunately, the threats that led to terrorist attacks like the ones we saw in last year in New York and New Jersey and the Boston Marathon bombings are not diminishing, they are evolving. And once again, it is time for Congress to put its money where its mouth is. I appreciate the majority's efforts to negotiate cut-go waivers to authorize funding levels for these programs above the appropriated levels. However, as ranking member of the Emergency Preparedness Subcommittee, what I hear from our first responders is that more federal support is needed to maintain and continue to build robust preparedness response capabilities. My own constituents have told me as much. As Sergeant Kearse, Director of New Jersey City's Office of Emergency Management and Homeland Security observed when he testified before my subcommittee, we do not have the luxury of making significant reductions to our capabilities without placing our nation at risk. If we are to continue to prepare and respond to and recover from evolving threats and disasters, we will need sufficient resources to sustain and adapt our capabilities accordingly. My amendment would authorize UASI and SGP at $900 million each to ensure the appropriators have the flexibility to fund the programs in a manner that addresses the national risks. We talk about the evolving threat. We talk about making our nation safe, about foreign fighters. We have an obligation to fund these programs at levels that will allow this nation to continue to be safe. We've been nonpartisan in this effort for years. I think we need to continue in that manner and hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle understand what we're trying to accomplish here and not wait to respond after the next, God forbid, threat that hits this nation. National preparedness is a national responsibility, and Congress should treat it that way. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Donovan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate what my ranking member, my friend Don Payne, has just said about the need to increase funding for training and resources for our first responders. President Obama's fiscal year budget requested $330 million for UASI funding. Our omnibus last year appropriated $605 million, an incredible increase. This year, the House bill of 2825 is proposing $800 million, excuse me. That is an increase of funding of $195 million for UASI, and for the State Homeland Security Grant Program, an increase of $133 million. These are both increases of the President's proposed budget, in which Ranking Member Thompson recognized that the amendments both are asking for. The funding levels in the amendment in the nature of a substitute were shared with the Democratic staff weeks ago, and they did not raise any concerns. In fact, the authorization for UASI in the amendment in the nature of substitute is $100 million more than the fiscal year 17 request to appropriators signed by a number of Democrats on this committee. First responder organizations such as the International Association of Fire Chiefs, National Fusion Center Association, and major county sheriffs association have expressed their support for funding levels in the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I offer their letters of support to be entered into the record. The authorizations for these programs contained in the amendment in the nature of substitute were subject of negotiations with leadership to get a CUTCO waiver, ensuring that our ability to get these generous increased authorization levels to the floor. Adoption of this amendment will ensure that no funding authorizations for first responders are adopted, and level appropriation funding will be all that we have. I understand the concerns that my friend Don Payne has, and it is our belief that the increases that are being proposed in the amendment of the nature of substitute, along with the support that we've received from outside groups, is a funding level which we believe we could get to the appropriators and get passed on the floor. At this time, I waive the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields. Is there any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. King is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I regret that I missed the early part of Mr. Diamond's presentation, all of Mr. Payne, so hope I don't duplicate too much of what they say. I just want, as somebody who lost over 150 people in my district, to me there's never enough money you can have for Homeland Security, but we have to do what we can to get money through. And I think the agreed amount here of, for instance, on Uwasi of $800 million, that's 2.5 times what President Obama asked for last year. It's almost double what President Trump asked for this year, and it's the third more than was passed last year in the Congress. So there's an increase of almost $200 million in Uwasi funding. Same with SHISCAP, which is 3 times more than what President Obama asked for last year, almost double what President Trump asked for this year, and it is $130 million more than was passed last year in the omnibus bill. Same, and I'll go on to ports and transit just to save the time of discussing it later. But that is also, again, double what was enacted into law last year, and it's more than twice what President Obama asked for, more than 4 times what President Trump asked for. And same with transit security. It's gone from $100 million last year to $200 million this year. And again, 2.5 times what President Obama asked for, and 4 times more than what President Trump. In the world in which we live, and the world where it's so tough to get budget money, the fact that you and the ranking member are able to get the concessions from the leadership, able to, at a time of budget cuts and government cuts, that we can put this money in. It goes to our first responders. It's very much needed. Again, as far as I'm concerned, you could put the sky in and I'd be satisfied with it. But we live in a real world. We can never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And this is good. These are good numbers. These are numbers that if we did go over them and we run the risk of not getting a bill through at all and not getting the numbers through at all on the House floor, we would have, I guess, used an old expression, cutting off our nose to spite our face. So this is, again, I commend you, Mr. Chairman, for putting these numbers, getting an agreement to get it to the House floor and for a vote. And it'll be, again, a significant improvement over the last several years. And so I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Does any member wish to?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking member is recognized.
And I appreciate the 2 gentlemen from New York's comment. I've been around a long time. I haven't really seen New Yorkers turn down an opportunity to get some money, but I guess there's a first Sunday in every month. But I think the point that I want to make is the president's budgets, both the Obama budget and the Trump budget, are blueprints. We have an opportunity to increase that opportunity given the threat environment that we live in. The gentleman from New Jersey's amendment is an opportunity to increase the resources given that threat environment. We've had briefing upon briefing by a number of people. I participated in a session with individuals from New York, and everybody in the meeting was saying we need more resources. So we heard you, and I think Mr. Payne's amendment is an opportunity to increase those resources, and for that reason, I support the gentleman from New Jersey's amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to support the gentleman from New Jersey's amendment as well. And I appreciate the honesty of the gentleman from New York who reminds us on a regular basis of the impact on his district, but also all of New York and the nation in experiencing the terrorist act of 9/11. For that reason, I think, if I might say, that we need to get serious, and we are, but more serious. The news has just come across with a gun incident in San Francisco where numbers have lost their life. Security is going to be a new phenomenon, or a ongoing phenomenon of which we have to live with. I remember being on this committee at its very beginning, and the US's grants in every jurisdiction are prized and treasured. They are needed. They are not reckless spending of dollars. In addition, I would make the argument that we will have to reconcile this fixture that we've used, this figment of our imagination called sequester, and really look at eliminating this heinous cap on serving the American people. It was a fig leaf that we were attempting to each group threaten the other group, and what we wound up with is a complete mess. Obviously, this is not the task of the Homeland Security Committee. I'm on the Budget Committee. I'll continue to raise these issues because this is a very ineffective way of running the government. Mr. Payne's amendment is a common sense. It raises it only about a little under $200 million, I believe, from 8 to 200 million, if I have the numbers correct. I think that is a very common sense approach, and I've been at a number of announcements with local community first responders who couldn't be more happy with the resources they've had from the US's grants to be able to purchase needed elements. Although it wasn't Homeland Security, I've got small towns of which I was able to give body armor and ambulances. If you can imagine, in the 18th Congressional District, which is partly rural and urban, that I had towns that didn't have a updated ambulance for the first responders. These are the elements that can be utilized. I associate the efforts of Mr. Payne with the efforts of Mr. Thompson. And that is, and I hope that we'll have enough thinking time to be able to support Mr. Thompson's amendment, which was the plussing up of the FEMA nonprofit security grant. And I'm looking at a letter from the Jewish Federation. This past weekend, I stood with those from the Muslim community who had experienced ongoing hateful marches in the name of the Act America. And these mosques if any of you visited the mosques, you will see much faith, much prayers, and of course, much concern for the families, the women and children that come to mosques. So hopefully the plus up of the 50 million, hope we will support that to allow these mosques or these synagogues and other places of worship to be able to use these to secure their facilities. These monies are valuable. This is part of our task, and if we have to go to leadership and convince them that security is now more than ever a crucial issue for all of us as members, but a crucial issue for our constituents. So I rise to support the gentleman's amendment. I thank him for his leadership. I thank the Ranking Member, Mr. Thompson, for the plussing up of the FEMA nonprofit security grant. I hope that it passes. I hope that the mosques and synagogues and other religious institutions will encourage that it pass, and that we not put sequesters or budget deals in front of security. I just think we cannot do it. With that, I yield back and ask for support of these amendments.
General Lay yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak as a supporter of Mr. Payne's amendment and to recognize how important these grants are, and to recognize that my location, we're not eligible to those grants. We weren't. We are going to be now, and so they're very important to our community. I would very much like to yield the balance of my time to my colleague, Mr. Payne.
I'd like to thank the gentlelady for yielding. To my chairman on the subcommittee and former chairman of this whole committee, two gentlemen I have great respect for. I look at this issue as important as the defense budget. And I know how my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are always looking for a strong defense in this nation. These dollars that we're talking about are as important as the defense budget. This is to defend our homeland. Our Army fights all over the world, and thank God that we have not had to have them fight a war in this nation. But these homeland dollars keeps our country safe. It is as important as the defense budget. And so I don't understand why there is a rationale, and rightfully so, for a strong defense, that we wouldn't want to see the same thing in the homeland. Our budget is trillions of dollars. Another $100 million in the scheme of that budget is not great. It would be a lot of money for first responders and the defense of the homeland, but in the whole scheme of the budget, another $100 million is a drop in the bucket, but can make a great difference in what we do for our first responders, people to keep us safe, people like that responded today in Alexandria, to make sure that they have the training and the equipment that they need to do what they did today for members of Congress and the public in this nation. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Richmond is recognized.
I would just quickly start where my colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, left off, and that is part of what makes America that beacon that stands out and to the entire world is the fact that we understand humanity and that we will right injustices when we see them. But to the extent that we are 911 to the world, we have to make sure we're 911 to our communities. And with the number of soft targets and the number of first responders that put themselves in harm's way every day to protect our families, we have to be equally concerned with them. And we know that we are great humanitarians, but we also know we have to have humanity, and it should start at home. And I think that this is just an amendment that highlights the fact that we fully recognize our commitment and our responsibility to the world, but we also understand our responsibility to our various communities and our first responders, and that we should make sure that we send a message that we will prioritize and that this is important. So with that, I would just ask, you know, in the grand scheme of things, when we understand how tight the dollar is, but there's an old saying that you can be penny wise and a pound foolish. And I would just ask us not to be foolish in terms of how we decide to spend money. And, you know, that other saying is, it's better to be safe than sorry, and it's better to be prepared than not be prepared. So with that, I would yield back and just ask my colleagues to consider the amendment, support the amendment, and support the message that it would send in terms of where we start with 911 and our humanity. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion? Ms. Berrigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to start by thanking Representative Payne for allowing me to co-sponsor this much-needed amendment. The State Homeland Security Grant Program and Urban Area Security Initiative grants are important to help our states and counties prepare for threats to our homeland. In my district, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's and fire departments rely on these grants to support their first responders, especially in the area of interoperable communications. These threats and risk assessments are critical to protecting our states and urban areas, which are often the front lines of homeland security. Just the other day, I was listening to Secretary Kelly, and he was talking about investing in the men and women who protect our homeland, and commented that you can never invest too much in security. As my colleagues have stated, in this grand scheme of this adding dollars to this area is a wise idea, and why I would ask my colleagues, urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. I also rise in support of this amendment, and not to repeat what's already been said here today, but my local police chiefs have also indicated to me that they live on these grants, and they're very critical to their mission on a day-to-day basis to keep our citizens safe. So, again, I also support this amendment. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the amendment? Let me just say that this proposed authorization more than doubles what President Obama submitted in his budget, and more than doubles what President Trump proposed in his budget request. So we are increasing twofold to $1.8 billion. I would always like more money going towards these grants. I think they're very worthwhile. We worked very hard with leadership to get what's called a cut-go waiver, which is an extraordinary accomplishment in and of itself to get a waiver like that from leadership. And so this was obviously the highest number we could get to get the cut-go waiver. While in spirit I support this amendment, I see the reality that would also undermine the ability of this bill to go to the floor. And so for that reason, I'm opposed to this amendment. I also want to add to the record, Mr. Donovan referenced letters in his statement, so without objection, those letters will be entered into the record. Any further discussion? There being no further discussion on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Payne, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested pursuant to previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Listed next on the roster is amendment number 007, offered by the gentlelady from New Jersey. Ms. Watson-Coleman, would the gentlelady like to offer her amendment?
Thank you. Yes, I would, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2825, offered by Mrs. Watson-Coleman.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I represent the 12th Congressional District of New Jersey, which stretches from Trenton to Scotch Plains and is connected by a web of mass transit systems. Every day, thousands of passengers pass through my district on Amtrak, SEPTA, and New Jersey Transit trains, and my constituents rely on these transit lines to get to and from work safely every day. Last Congress, I attended a field hearing held in Congressman Payne's district in New Jersey to learn about surface transportation security capabilities and challenges in northern New Jersey following the 2016 March attacks in Brussels. At this hearing, we heard testimony from Amtrak, New Jersey Transit, and the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and the Metropolitan Transit Authority, all of whom testified that the transit security grant programs play an integral role in securing their infrastructure. This Congress, as ranking member of Transportation and Protective Security subcommittees, I have come to appreciate the criticality of the Transit Security Grant Program even more. Despite the ongoing threats to surface transportation, only about 2% of the Transportation Security Administration's budget support surface transportation security activities. Accordingly, the bulk of the burden to secure surface transportation falls on transit owners and operators whose efforts are supported in part by the Transit Security Grant Program. Last year, the president of the American Public Transportation Association testified before a Senate committee that transit agencies across the United States had identified $6 billion in capital and operational security needs. The current funding level of $100 million is hardly enough to begin to help transit owners and operators meaningfully address the $6 billion resource shortfall. Further, President Trump's $48 million request for transit security for FY 2018 is absurd and shameful. I appreciate the majority's effort to obtain a limited cut-go waiver for this program to plus up funding to $200 million. But the $200 million funding level authorized in the underlying measure is too low of a cap to place on a program that should be sufficiently flexible to meet pressing security needs. The threats to surface transportation are only growing, and we need to ensure that funding is available to help close that $6 billion transit security gap. That is why I am offering an amendment to increase the TSGP authorization level from $200 million to $400 million. Although it does not require that appropriations fund TSGP at that level, it gives them the flexibility to do so should funding become available within the relevant 302B allocation. It also sends an important message to transit owners and operators of department and appropriations that we think securing our service transportation systems is a top priority. I'd like to offer, for unanimous consent, to offer this letter dated June the 13th from the American Public Transportation Association.
Without objection?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with that, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Donovan's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think what's evident to all of us, my neighboring colleague, Ms. Watson-Coleman, is that there's a great need for an increase in funding grants for transportation. The Obama administration's proposed budget had $93 million in it. The President's current budget proposal has half of that in there. That's why I think the $200 million that we're putting in there is a recognition of the need to help our transit systems, to protect our riders, their customers, and the citizens of our great nation. For the reasons that I stated before, I reluctantly oppose the increase. When you look at the total increase in grant programs in this budget now, in our authorization, it goes from $708 million in the Obama budget to $1.8 billion in this authorization. And it's numbers that we're proud of. It's numbers, as you said, and Member Watson-Coleman said, my friend Don Payne said, we can never have enough money. But as Representative King pointed out, with the realization that there are limited dollars in our budget, these increases are significant. And as I said, with the letters of support that we have, it seems that the people on the ground who have to do this day in and day out are supportive of these numbers as well. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields. Is there any further discussion on the amendment?
Chairman.
Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Let me take up my good friend who just responded to the Congresswoman from New Jersey. We've all worked hard on these issues during the course of this committee. We've had the privilege of serving on a number of subcommittees, but in particular the Transportation Security Committee and Border Control Committee. And I think the gentlelady has a very good point. First of all, the transit system, whether it is the commuter rail or it is long-distance transit, period, is a massive system on the rail side. And then, of course, it has other components to it. There is no doubt that there's a plus-up and that there are agreements. But I, again, raise the point. We can't agree away the new atmosphere and conditions that we're in. I think transit can be more secure. I think the training is more crucial. Just as we are a democratic nation, our transit system is one of the most open. and I certainly believe that a plus-up is needed. Homeland Security is going to have to be at the forefront of raising the question about the value of the sequester in light of the rising needs and cost of securing the nation and securing individuals. In the course of just a couple of hours, we've seen incidences that reflect on the question of security. So I want to congratulate the gentlelady for this amendment. I think that there are holes in the funding that these extra dollars will fill, and there is no doubt that it is a massively used system, transit is, and it's almost in every aspect and corner of America. And I believe that those dollars are well needed, and I'd ask my colleagues to support the Watson-Coleman amendment. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, question now occurs on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Watson-Coleman. All is in favor signify by saying aye. All is opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. McCall, I respectfully request a recorded vote.
The
Thank you,
recorded
Chairman.
vote has been requested pursuant to previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. The chair would like to announce that votes will be rolled until 3:30 or at the conclusion of Title VII, whichever comes first. Listed next on the roster is amendment number 009, offered by the gentlelady from Florida. Ms. Demings, would the gentlelady like to offer her amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk shall report.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2825, offered by Mrs. Demings.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. As you know, we talk about a lot of things in Congress, but nothing matters more to me than the safety of my constituents. Earlier this week, we observed the one-year anniversary of the Pulse nightclub attack. As the first responders from my district, many of them former co-workers, responded to the scene, the dedicated staff and analysts at the Central Florida Intelligence Exchange, CFIX, a member of DHS's National Network of Fusion Centers, immediately began to gather and share critical information. Working together, the courageous first responders and CFIX personnel were able to save lives and identify the perpetrator. The capabilities that led to their successful response were created through previous grant investments, in particular, the Urban Area Security Initiative. Unfortunately, the old URASI funding that is supporting some capabilities in Orlando will soon expire, and despite the Pulse nightclub shooting where 49 people died, many more injured, and many other important factors, Orlando is once again an unfunded URASI, as well as many other cities across our nation. My concern is this: what will happen to the capabilities developed with previous grant support now that funding is no longer available? My amendment would help to address that problem. It would create a $58 million competitive grant program for the purposes of allowing high-risk urban areas that were previously eligible to receive funds from URASI to preserve core capability gains with previous grant support. As Secretary Kelly acknowledged before this panel last week, the threat of terrorism, and I quote, has metastasized around the country, whether it's New York City, the largest municipality in the country, or some small town in the middle of Arkansas. The potential is about the same, in my view, for a lone wolf attack. That is how the Secretary of Homeland Security described it last week. My constituents in Florida know all too well the truth, the painful truth of the Secretary's words. I lived it for 27 years as a first responder, and I believe we have no greater obligation than to keep the people that we represent safe from harm. No city in America can afford to lose ground on preparedness. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Does any other amendment have, or member have any further discussion? Mr. Donovan.
Mr. Chairman, I certainly understand everything that my colleague from Florida has just described. I represent New York City, which saw the devastations of what happened September 11th. I had a third of the firefighters in my district who died that day lived in Staten Island. Unfortunately, the amendment that has been proposed now implicates, as you've said earlier in some of the other amendments, the jurisdiction of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee.
It's been cleared up.
Oh, it's been cleared up? Okay. I've just been told that that has been cleared up.
Yes, it has.
That objection. Thank you. I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Longivan's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I want to thank the gentlelady for and commend her for offering the amendment. My state in Rhode Island was one of those states that had received UOSI funds, and in 2011, for whatever reason, the UOSI grant or states were rolled back from 64 to 29. Didn't mean the needs went away, just meant that those UOSI cities were no longer going to be funded. I commend the gentlelady for offering an amendment. What it would do is just reinstate and allow funds to be used to UOSI communities that had previously been approved and now had created infrastructure programs that were needed in those communities, would now allow those communities to get funded once again. And again, the need has not gone away, but the funding has. And I believe that the need obviously existed before. We should recognize that the need is still there. And again, with those programs or infrastructure was created, this would allow those funds to be once again used for those purposes. In Rhode Island, for example, one of our UOSI grants enabled 9 urban area communities to purchase equipment and conduct planning activities that would further strengthen local schools. The UOSI School Security Initiative supplied security cameras and enhanced door locks and established the Be Safe program for schools to have standardized plans to respond to an all-hazards event. So again, the need hasn't gone away, and a program like this was created, but needs to be maintained, and the funding had dried up. This would reinstate that funding to at least allow those initiatives that had been started to continue. So I hope that my colleagues would consider supporting this this worthwhile amendment and the concept, and I thank the gentlelady for offering the event, and I will yield to the gentlelady from Texas.
I thank you. I rise to support Congresswoman Dimmon's amendment as well. And I just want to say to the chairman, if I can strike the last word for the colloquy, but I want to speak to it. I'm not sure if I can speak to it in this time frame, but there's one point that I want to make about the Congresswoman and I think is important about listening to the offering of this increasing or supporting the sustainment grants is the value of 27 years of experience as a first responder. Many of us come at this either through our interaction with our firefighters, our police officers. I've served on the bench, and I have seen officers when they've been in the midst of an investigation, and then of course for those of us here in the United States Congress during 9/11, just to see the horror of it unfolding before our very eyes. But at the same time, I am reminded that many of us who were here at that time were grounded. We could not fly. We could not travel by any mode. We might have been able to get in a car, but those of us west of the Mississippi might have had a difficult time. But what I will say is, when we arrived home, we understood that those first responders, whether or not they were in Washington, D.C., they were on call. They needed the kind of support systems to ensure that they could do the job for their constituents. And I just want us to get away from sequester, and I don't want us to be reckless. I want us to get away from this budget and what restraints we have. We are in a new day, and security has to be, along with our respect for due process and civil liberties and civil rights, we must put that in the forefront. So, Congresswoman, let me thank you for your leadership, and I wholeheartedly support your amendment, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking members recognized.
Thank you very much. I'm rising in support of the gentlelady from Florida's amendment for a number of reasons. Sustainment for a lot of communities is important. Capacity to keep communities safe is important, and we can't go back. I'd like to read former Iwasi communities that potentially could benefit from this sustainment amendment. Albany, Austin, Bakersfield, Baton Rouge, Bridgeport, Buffalo, Columbus, El Paso, Hartford, Honolulu, Jacksonville, Kansas City, Louisville, Memphis, Milwaukee, Nashville, New Orleans, Oklahoma City, Omaha, Oxnard, Providence, Richmond, Rochester, Sacramento, San Juan, Syracuse, Toledo, Tucson, and Tulsa. These communities, under other formulas, receive UASI money. So here's an opportunity for us to spread the opportunity to make communities safe in some instances. But sustainment is important. So I'm not sure where the maker of the amendment will be, if there's been some agreement to work with her on it. But I think there's no question that the communities I've outlined absolutely deserve consideration under this program. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion? Chair recognizes himself. Let me say I share the concerns of the gentlelady from Orlando, and I have the same concerns with my hometown of Austin, Texas, which was a former UASI jurisdiction. I do believe we need to address this issue, so I am willing to enter into an agreement with the gentlelady. If she would withdraw her amendment, what I would like to do is specifically amend Section 621, which I offered, the Community Counterterrorism Grant program of the ANS, so it applies to former UASI jurisdictions and expands the allowable uses to include all uses under UASI. Further, should this provision go to the floor, which it did previously, I would very much like to work with the gentlelady to include it in the standalone bill as well.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your willingness to work with me and just ensure the safety of our cities, to support former URASIs, to make sure that they're able to maintain at least the current level of capability. And so I do look forward to working with you to do that. And with that, I withdraw my amendment. Thank you so much again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman, woman yields back, and I certainly appreciate your spirit of cooperating. I'm certain we will reach an agreement on this very issue. It's important, I think, to not just me and you, but probably all members of this committee. And so without objection, the lady's amendment is withdrawn. Listed next on the roster is amendment number 008, offered by the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Berrigan. Would the gentlelady like to offer the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk and wish to have it considered at this time.
Clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 2825, offered by Ms. Barragan.
Without objection, readings dispensed with. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 2 letters from the American Association of Port Authorities and the National Association of Waterfront Employers in support of increasing the port security grants.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I represent the Port of Los Angeles, an economic engine that has the highest container volume in the country. It supports over 500,000 jobs in Southern California and generates $270 billion in U.S. trade. It touches every congressional district in this country. The activity at the Port of Los Angeles and at other ports across the nation are essential to our economic and national security. The risks to the Port of Los Angeles continue to evolve, whether it's a threat of dangerous cargo entering through the port, unauthorized individuals gaining access, or growing cybersecurity threats. Ports remain high-value targets to those who do us harm. The Port of Los Angeles has made significant investments to address these threats. With the help of the port security grants, the Ports Control Center has invested millions in technical security assets, including port reliance and recovery, IED and explosives prevention, and cybersecurity. These smart security investments have made the Port of Los Angeles more secure, but they are not a one-time investment. They are investments in security capabilities that must be maintained over time. In fiscal years 2008 and 2009, Congress appropriated $400 million for the Port Security Grant Program. Since then, funding has been reduced to $100 million, and the President's budget would add insult to injury by funding the port security grants at a mere $48 million. Port security is too important to our national security and economic vitality to be subject to these huge cuts. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields. Is there any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Donovan's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I live in an area that's so dependent on the port of New York and New Jersey, and I share borders with my friends from New Jersey and the interest in the security of our ports. The appropriation that we are putting forth today increases the current expenditure of $100 million to $200 million for our port security. It's an increase over the Obama budget. It's an increase over the Trump budget by 4 times as much as the Trump budget is proposing. And for the reasons that I had previously stated in my objection, my reluctant objection to the other amendments offered by my friends, I yield the balance of my time, but I object to this amendment.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, let me say I had an opportunity to be in the Maker of the Amendments district, Ms. Barragon, and I saw firsthand what the Los Angeles Long Beach port means not only to the western part of this country, but to the rest of the United States. But I also heard from the Coast Guard as well as people at the port how important resources are needed to shore up those facilities. I have 3 ports in my district. I wish I had one a tenth the size of the LA port. I'd be real happy, but I don't. But most of us have some facility like what these grants mean. Most of us have individuals who come to our offices asking for support of the programs because state and locals really don't have the resources to provide the necessary security. I encourage the members of the committee to support it. It's the right thing to do. If our ports are not secure, many of the goods and services we take for granted in shopping and doing otherwise would not be available to us. So I would encourage support for Ms. Barragon's amendment.
The gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Payne is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I represent the 2 most dangerous miles in America, where the rail lines intersect with the ports, with the airport, and with the interstate, and other high-value targets. Chief among those targets is Port Newark, one of the busiest ports on the eastern coast, eastern seaboard, which mirrors LA and Long Beach's port. The port is a driver of economic growth, facilitating trade and creating jobs. The Port Security Grant Program has improved security of port facilities and port areas by supporting the purchase of vessels and vehicles and detection systems, including sensors and cameras. The Port Security Grant Program is also critical to helping address the cybersecurity challenges that threaten the security at port areas. I support Ms. Barragan's amendment to increase the authorization for the Port Security Grant Program because despite the progress made to secure the port areas and port facilities, there is still more to do. And it once again goes back to my plea in my amendment. I mean, how much is too much to make sure that we create and meet our mission here in Homeland Security of securing every aspect of our homeland that are high-risk targets. And we know that the ports of entry are high risk. And so once again, as I stated, these programs are as important as the defense budget in making our homeland safe. And I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Berrigan. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, could I request a recorded vote, please?
A recorded vote has been requested pursuant to previous announcement. This vote will be postponed.
Thank you.
There are no additional amendments listed on the roster to Title VI. Are there any further amendments to Title VI of the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none, we will now move on to consideration of amendments to Title VII. I now call up Title VII of the amendment in the nature of a substitute for consideration. We have agreement on a number of amendments to Title VII, so pursuant to the chairman's previous announcement, I ask unanimous consent to consider the following amendments en bloc. Mr. Perry, number 1. Mr. Perry, number 046. Ms. Rice, number 009. Mr. Correa, number 002. Mr. Correa, number 013. Without objection, so ordered, the clerk shall report the en bloc amendment.
En bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 2825, offered by Mr. McCall.
Without objection, reading of the en bloc amendment is dispensed with. Does any member with an amendment included in the en bloc wish to be recognized? Mr. Correa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you, first of all, for working with me and for supporting these two amendments. First Amendment proposes to authorize an appropriation for the DHS Office of Inspector General at $175 million for fiscal years 2018 and 2019. The Office of Inspector General is an important oversight entity responsible for auditing and inspecting DHS programs. This office gets results. For every dollar that this office spends on oversight, the office returns over $7 to the taxpayers by identifying and eliminating fraud, waste, and abuse. My second amendment authorizes the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection to request additional canine teams to address documented shortages. We found out here in this committee that canine teams serve a critical function and are one of our greatest assets to stop, identify drugs at the border. Rather than spending billions on a border wall that won't keep the drugs out, we can invest in proven and effective tools such as canines for drug detection. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support my amendments, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion of the en bloc amendment? Ms. Rice is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment would permanently reauthorize the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Business Travel Card Program. Under this program, nearly 30,000 American business and government cardholders, including more than 2,000 New Yorkers, can access fast-track lanes at airports in the 21 APEC countries, which saves an average of 43 minutes per trip. This is a successful program that operates at no cost to taxpayers. Applicants must be U.S. citizens and verified business or government travelers. They must pay a $70 fee, and they must pre-enroll in a U.S. Trusted Traveler program like Global Entry. Right now, the program is set to expire on September 30th, 2018, meaning that no new cards can be issued after that date, and all cards will expire by 2021, after which Americans will no longer be able to travel throughout the region as efficiently as business travelers from other APEC countries. My amendment would permanently reauthorize the authority to issue APEC business travel cards to American citizens while maintaining DHS's authority to revoke or suspend an individual's card for security reasons at any time. I want to thank Congressman Dan Donovan for his strong support for reauthorizing this program. This is a common-sense bipartisan priority, and I urge all of my colleagues to give it their support. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion on the en bloc amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. King is recognized.
I just want to commend my colleague from New York, Ms. Rice, for her work on this. It's a needed amendment, and again, it's a true bipartisan spirit, so I'm proud to support it.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the en bloc amendment? There being no further,
Mr. Chairman, and I
Ms. Jackson-Lee?
want to be able to enter the colloquy after you pass the number 6 en bloc.
Okay.
Yeah.
There being no further discussion, question now occurs on the en bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the en bloc amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady is recognized.
I'd like to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We have, as part of the Department of Homeland Security, which a number of us worked on over the years, the Chief Privacy and Chief Civil Liberties Officer. And I believe their work is important enough that they should be able to testify before our committee at least once each Congress. And maybe as the ranking member and chairman would allow, it may be appropriate for them to do it more often. The Department of Homeland Security Privacy Office is the first statutorily required privacy office in any federal agency. The department's chief privacy officer is responsible for evaluating department programs, systems, and initiatives for potential privacy impacts and providing mitigation strategies to reduce the privacy impact. Many of us know that the privacy question, as we begin to deal with Homeland Security and a number of new stringent laws regarding security, the privacy community was enormously concerned about their constitutional rights. There have been 6 chief privacy officers since the inception of the department. The Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, which has become very important in light of the diverse populations that we have in this country, supports the department's mission to secure the nation while preserving individual liberty, fairness, and equality under the law. Those are issues that are bipartisan. There are members in both sides of the aisle that are very concerned about the protection of civil rights and civil liberties. The CRCL integrates civil rights and civil liberties into all of the department's activities. I've hosted meetings with data protection officers from several EU nations, Canada and Mexico, and I know that the work of these offices is relevant to the work of the committee and the world watches as we protect our nation but protect civil liberties and civil rights. So I would hope that we would move in that direction. I know the work of the Privacy Office influence privacy and civil liberties organizations' decisions to actually support DHS, rightly so, taking the lead role in domestic cybersecurity. So I'd hope, Mr. Chairman, that we could implement that process.
Let me thank the gentlelady for her comments. I think it's a very important office that provides guidance to this committee. In fact, the Office of Privacy and Civil Liberties was instrumental in our ability to pass our version of the Cybersecurity Act. And I think to the members who obviously appreciate the constitutional protections we have and our privacy issues was one of the fundamental reasons why DHS became the lead civilian agency to the private sector rather than the military and NSA. And so I appreciate your comments, and I welcome the opportunity to afford them an opportunity to testify before this committee.
Well, let me appreciate that response, Mr. Chairman. You know, I've worked on the Privacy Office and believe it's, as you have said, it's crucial to the work that we do and the kind of nation that we live in, the kind of nation we show to the world. So I thank you very much, and with that, I look forward to their testimony forthcoming, and I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Per the roster agreement listed next is amendment number 012, offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa. Would the gentleman like to offer his amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk and wish to be recognized.
The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 2825, offered by Mr. Correa.
Without objection, reading is dispensed with, and Mr. Correa is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The John Wayne Airport in Orange County currently operates under Custom and Border Protection as a user fee airport program, which requires the airport to reimburse CBP for the cost of federal inspection services. Airports that are designated as ports of entry do not have to reimburse the same federal inspection services that John Wayne Airport does, as other similar airports pay. This places these airports like John Wayne at a disadvantage with other regional airports with international services. In some cases, some airports under the user fee airport program have more international passenger flights than airports designated as ports of entry. My amendment is intended to allow medium hub airports, such as John Wayne, that have one or more scheduled international services that receive more than 75,000 international passengers arrivals per year, to be designated as ports of entry. Mr. Chair, this is an issue of taxpayer equity for the residents of Orange County. Unfortunately, during our negotiations for this markup, we weren't able to get a satisfactory place with the amendment and would like to continue to work with you and my colleagues to revisit this issue in the future. With that, I would like to ask for unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment.
The gentleman asks unanimous consent to withdraw his amendment. Without objection, so ordered. And let me just say I appreciate the gentleman's willingness to work with the chairman on this issue. Our biggest concern is the jurisdiction within the amendment is within Ways and Means Committee, which would violate the memorandum of understanding that we entered into with 7 other chairmen. So in the spirit of cooperation, I look forward to working with the gentleman. Does any other member wish to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? The committee postponed further proceedings on the recorded vote on amendment number 003 to the amendment in the nature of substitute to the bill H.R. 2825, offered by Mr. Thompson, on which the noes have prevailed by voice vote. Question now occurs in agreeing to the amendment in the nature of substitute. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Smith. Mr. King. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Marino. Mr. Barletta. Mr. Barletta votes no. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Katko. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd votes no. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe. Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Donovan. Mr. Donovan votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford votes no. Mr. Garrett. Mr. Garrett votes no. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick votes no. Mr. Thompson.
Aye.
Mr. Thompson votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee. Aye. Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Aye. Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Richmond. Aye. Mr. Richmond votes aye. Mr. Keating. Aye. Mr. Keating votes aye. Mr. Payne. Aye. Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Vela. Mrs. Watson-Coleman. Ms. Rice. Ms. Rice votes aye. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes aye. Mrs. Demings. Mrs. Demings votes aye. Ms. Barragon. Ms. Barragon votes aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. King? Mr. King votes no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Marino? Mr. Katko? Mr. Katko votes no. Mr. Vela? Mrs. Watson-Coleman? Mrs. Watson-Coleman votes aye.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to record or change his vote? How am I recorded?
Mr. Chairman, you are not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. McCall votes no.
Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 11 yeas and 15 noes.
The noes have it, and the Bella Thompson. And the
Mr.
Bella
Chairman.
amendment offered by
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman.
Thompson. Mr. Hurd is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to change my vote to a yea.
Okay. Clerk shall report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on the revised vote, there were 12 yeas and 14 noes.
The noes have it, and the Vella amendment offered by Mr. Thompson is not agreed to. Committee postponed further proceedings on the recorded vote on the amendment number 031 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill H.R. 2825 offered by Ms. Watson-Coleman, on which the noes have prevailed by voice vote. Question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment in nature of a substitute. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith? Mr. King?
No.
Mr. King votes no. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Marino? Mr. Barletta? No. Mr. Barletta votes no. Mr. Perry? No. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Katko? No. Mr. Katko votes no. Mr. Hurd? No. Mr. Hurd votes no. Ms. McSally? No. Ms. McSally votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? No. Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Donovan? No. Mr. Donovan votes no. Mr. Gallagher? No. Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Higgins? No. Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Rutherford? No. Mr. Rutherford votes no. Mr. Garrett? No. Mr. Garrett votes no. Mr. Fitzpatrick? No. Mr. Fitzpatrick votes no. Mr. Thompson? Aye. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Aye. Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Langevin? Aye. Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Richmond? Aye. Mr. Richmond votes aye. Mr. Keating? Aye. Mr. Keating votes aye. Mr. Payne? Aye. Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Vela? Mrs. Watson-Coleman? Aye. Mrs. Watson-Coleman votes aye. Ms. Rice? Yes. Ms. Rice votes aye. Mr. Correa? Aye. Mr. Correa votes aye. Mrs. Demings? Yes. Mrs. Demings votes aye. Mrs. Barragon? Yes. Mrs. Barragon votes aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Duncan? Mr. Marino? Mr. Vela?
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to record or change his vote? How am I recorded?
You are not. The chairman is not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. McCall votes no.
Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 11 yeas and 15 noes.
The noes have it in the opinion of the chair, then the Watson-Coleman amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute is not agreed to. Committee postponed further proceedings on the recorded vote for amendment number 2 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2825 offered by Mr. Thompson, on which the noes prevail by voice vote. Question occurs on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith? Mr. King?
No.
Mr. King votes no. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Marino? Mr. Barletta? No. Mr. Barletta votes no. Mr. Perry? No. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Katko? No. Mr. Katko votes no. Mr. Hurd? No. Mr. Hurd votes no. Ms. McSally? No. Ms. McSally votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? No. Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Donovan? No. Mr. Donovan votes no. Mr. Gallagher? No. Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Higgins? No. Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Rutherford? No. Mr. Rutherford votes no. Mr. Garrett? No. Mr. Garrett votes no. Mr. Fitzpatrick? No. Mr. Fitzpatrick votes no. Mr. Thompson? Aye. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Aye. Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Langevin? Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Richmond? Mr. Richmond votes aye. Mr. Keating? Mr. Keating votes aye. Mr. Payne? Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Vela? Mrs. Watson Coleman? Mrs. Watson Coleman votes aye. Ms. Rice? Ms. Rice votes aye. Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Mrs. Demings? Mrs. Demings votes aye. Ms. Barragon? Ms. Barragon votes aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Duncan? Mr. Marino? Mr. Vela?
Have all members voted? Did any member wish to change his vote?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Katko is recognized.
I request to change my vote to an aye.
Okay. Mr. Katko votes aye.
Mr. Katko votes aye.
How am I recorded?
Mr. Chairman, you are not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. McCall votes no.
Clerk shall report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 12 yeas and 14 noes.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the Thompson amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute is not agreed to. Committee postponed further proceedings on the recorded vote on amendment number 006 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill H.R. 2825 offered by Mr. Payne, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. Question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Smith? Mr. King? No. Mr. King votes no. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Marino? Mr. Barletta? No. Mr. Barletta votes no. Mr. Perry? No. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Katko? No. Mr. Katko votes no. Mr. Hurd? No. Mr. Hurd votes no. Ms. McSally? No. Ms. McSally votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Donovan? No. Mr. Donovan votes no. Mr. Gallagher? No. Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Rutherford? No. Mr. Rutherford votes no. Mr. Garrett? No. Mr. Garrett votes no. Mr. Fitzpatrick? Mr. Fitzpatrick votes no. Mr. Thompson? Aye. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Langevin? Aye. Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Richmond? Aye. Mr. Richmond votes aye. Mr. Keating? Aye. Mr. Keating votes aye. Mr. Payne? Aye. Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Vela? Mrs. Watson Coleman? Yes. Mrs. Watson Coleman votes aye. Ms. Rice? Yes. Ms. Rice votes aye. Mr. Correa? Yes. Mr. Correa votes aye. Mrs. Demings? Yes. Mrs. Demings votes aye. Ms. Barragon? Ms. Barragon votes aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Duncan? Mr. Marino? Mr. Vela?
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to record or change his vote? How am I recorded?
Mr. Chairman, you are not recorded.
I vote no. Clerk shall report.
Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 11 yeas and 15 noes.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the Payne amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute is not agreed to. Committee postponed further proceedings on the record vote on amendment number 007 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill H.R. 2825 offered by Ms. Watson Coleman, on which the noes have prevailed by voice vote. Question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Smith? Mr. King? No. Mr. King votes no. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Marino? Mr. Barletta? No. Mr. Barletta votes no. Mr. Perry? No. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Katko? No. Mr. Katko votes no. Mr. Hurd? No. Mr. Hurd votes no. Ms. McSally? No. Ms. McSally votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Donovan? No. Mr. Donovan votes no. Mr. Gallagher? No. Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Higgins? No. Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Rutherford? No. Mr. Rutherford votes no. Mr. Garrett? No. Mr. Garrett votes no. Mr. Fitzpatrick? No. Mr. Fitzpatrick votes no. Mr. Thompson? Aye. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Aye. Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Langevin? Aye. Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Richmond? Aye. Mr. Richmond votes aye. Mr. Keating? Aye. Mr. Keating votes aye. Mr. Payne? Aye. Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Vela? Mrs. Watson Coleman. Mrs. Watson Coleman votes aye. Ms. Rice. Ms. Rice votes aye. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes aye. Mrs. Demings. Mrs. Demings votes aye. Mrs. Barragon. Ms. Barragon votes aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Marino. Mr. Vela.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to record or change his vote? How am I recorded?
Mr. Chairman, you are not recorded.
The chair votes no.
Mr. McCall votes no.
Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 11 yeas and 15 noes.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the Watson-Coleman Amendment number 007 to the amendment in the nature of substitute is not agreed to. Committee postponed further proceedings on the recorded vote on amendment number 008 to the amendment in the nature of substitute to the bill H.R. 2825 offered by Ms. Berrigan, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. Question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of substitute. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Smith. Mr. King. No. Mr. King votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Marino. Mr. Barletta. Mr. Barletta votes no. Mr. Perry. No. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Cacco. No. Mr. Cacco votes no. Mr. Hurd. No. Mr. Hurd votes no. Ms. McSally. No. Ms. McSally votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe. No. Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Donovan. No. Mr. Donovan votes no. Mr. Gallagher. No. Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Rutherford. No. Mr. Rutherford votes no. Mr. Garrett. No. Mr. Garrett votes no. Mr. Fitzpatrick. No. Mr. Fitzpatrick votes no. Mr. Thompson. Aye. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee. Aye. Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Aye. Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Richmond. Mr. Keating. Aye. Mr. Keating votes aye. Mr. Payne. Aye. Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Vela. Mrs. Watson Coleman. Yes. Mrs. Watson Coleman votes aye. Ms. Rice. Ms. Rice votes aye. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes aye. Mrs. Demings. Yes. Mrs. Demings votes aye. Ms. Barragon. Ms. Barragon votes aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Marino. Mr. Richmond. Aye. Mr. Richmond votes aye. Mr. Vela.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to record or change his vote? How am I recorded?
Mr. Chairman, you're not recorded.
Chair votes no.
Mr. McCall votes no.
Clerk shall report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 11 yeas and 15 noes.
In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it, and the Berrigan amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute is not agreed to. Question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2825 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. Question now occurs on reporting H.R. 2825
Chairman.
as amended.
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Jackson Lee
there are
is
amendments
recognized.
not on the roster that I thought we'd call amendments not on the roster.
That's the answer.
I didn't ask for that. Well, then I asked unanimous consent.
All right. We asked if anybody had additional amendments on the roster in the correct sequence of the events of this proceeding, and there were none.
Well,
But as the bill goes to the floor, we'd be happy to work with the gentlelady.
well, Mr. Chairman, this was not on the roster, so I guess the language indicated was, I was looking for the language of any amendments not on the roster. That is what I was told to listen for. I'd ask a brief waiver, I'd ask unanimous consent to have a brief discussion.
The question was asked, are there any further amendments, and no one spoke up at the appropriate time. So I believe the time has expired for this. I don't quite understand what the gentlelady intends to offer.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would ask on this day that without, I'd ask unanimous consent and without objection to make a brief comment on the amendment and to indicate that I'd like to work on this amendment going to the floor.
What amendment is she referring to? Okay, the gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the Chairman. I will not take long to describe the amendment. When I say to describe the amendment, I will not describe the background of the amendment. I think we can do that between our mutual staff and minority and majority staff. But the underlying issue is that we do live in a different climate. There are much harsher responses to individuals who may be subject to deportation but are here in the United States with a variety of documents, work permit, family or citizen members working hard. I'll use the gentleman's name, Mr. Escobar. But the underlying reason for my suggested amendment are two-pronged. One would be that under DHS actions and decisions that are made, that within the confines of the law, that due process be adhered to. That may be a general language statement that we could work on together for the floor. The other is, of course, a more precise, and I understand that ICE is not in this reauthorization, but I just want to put it on the record, that when the local officers are dealing with individuals who are told to use the ICE office in the administrative appeal process, that minimally notice be given on the response to whoever the applicant is. In this instance, it was a lawyer who did not get a response of a denial or approval of a stay that they were asking for. So my amendment addresses this question of notice or response, which I think is minimal that we can give to those who are seeking some reprieve. But my overall underlying point is how the actions of the DHS can be acted upon with due process. And so I hope that we will have the opportunity to work on this point. I think it will be fair to all. It's not excessive. And I don't think anyone would want to be against the idea of due process, the rights of receiving information, which is really what due process is, that we're able to have a notice of where we stand in the process. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you and the ranking member for yielding, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 2825 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. This concludes the consideration of the bill noticed by the committee for today. And let me just say in closing, I want to thank all the members of this committee. The majority of these amendments were passed by voice, and they were bipartisan, which is a way this committee should operate. And I want to thank, again, the members, but also the staff on both sides of the aisle. I know there was a lot of work that went into this. This is a very significant moment in history for this committee to pass a full reauthorization, the first since the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. And so I'm personally proud of the members and the staff, and just wanted to say, give you my thanks.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. King, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Rule 22, Clause 1 of the Rules of the House, I move that the committee authorize the chairman to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the bill ordered reported by this committee today or on similar Senate bills.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking member is recognized.
before I give my closing, I'd like to also, in addition to both staffs on the majority and minority side, I'd also say to the Legislative Council people, Matt Elkstein, Hank Savage, Hadley Ross. They've been around a good while, and somehow we kind of miss them, but they're the ones who did the heavy lifting to make this work. So we want to make sure they are recognized too. But pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I ask that members have 2 calendar days to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, or minority views on the bill audit reported by the committee today.
Yeah, thank you. And the committee staff worked tirelessly. This is a monumental achievement, and I want to thank the ranking member for working closely with me. And so without objections to order, there being no further business to transact, the committee stands adjourned.